She had planned every detail of this night for 8 months. The flowers, the candlelight, the gown that cost more than most men earned in a year, and now Vivian Ashcroft stood alone at the head of the banquet table while 300 members of the empire's finest aristocracy watched her husband walk out the door, not toward the garden, not toward the retiring room, but toward the carriage of another woman whose laughter carried through the winter air like an open wound. What happened next would change the empire. Stay until the end. Because what looks like destruction sometimes turns out to be the first morning of an entirely different life. The flowers had been Vivian's idea. White dahlias, imported at considerable expense from the southern coast, arranged in cascading towers along the full length of the banquet hall at Rowan House. She had spent 3 weeks corresponding with the florist, arguing over stem height and petal density, insisting that the final arrangement carry a particular quality, something between severity and beauty, a combination she had always privately associated with herself. No one had told her that the flowers would outlast the marriage by roughly 6 hours. She was standing near the head table when it happened. The evening had reached the point where the champagne was flowing freely enough that small conversations had collapsed into larger ones, and the laughter filling Rowan House carried the particular pitch of people who were drinking not because they were happy, but because they were performing happiness on behalf of their host. Vivian had noticed that distinction early in the night. She was good at noticing things that other people preferred not to see. She was speaking with Lady Margot Ashby, or rather, she was listening to Margot speak, which was not quite the same thing, when she saw it. A footman appeared at the far end of the hall. He crossed the floor with the particular kind of discretion that men use when they are carrying information they know will cause damage, moving quickly enough to suggest urgency, slowly enough to suggest that the urgency was someone else's problem. He reached Lord Cedric Rowan's side, leaned close, and said something into her husband's ear. Vivian watched Cedric's face change. It was not a dramatic change. If she had been less practiced at reading him, she might have missed it entirely. But she had spent 2 years learning the architecture of his expressions, the small flicker at the corner of his mouth that meant he was calculating, the way his jaw shifted slightly when he was deciding whether to lie. She saw both of them now, in rapid succession, and she understood before he even moved what was about to happen. "Forgive me," Cedric said to the small group surrounding him. His voice was smooth, unbothered, the voice of a man who had never in his life been required to account for himself in a room full of people who depended on him. "A brief matter requiring my attention. I'll return momentarily." He did not look at Vivian. She noted that specifically. He did not look at her. Not a glance of apology, not the micro-flinch of a man who knows he is doing something wrong and has the decency to feel it. He simply turned and walked toward the main entrance, and the crowd parted for him the way crowds always parted for Cedric Rowan. Easily, naturally, without friction, as though his passage through any space was simply the natural order of things restoring itself. Vivian set her champagne glass down on the nearest surface. Lady Margot continued talking. The distance from where Vivian stood to the entrance hall was perhaps 40 feet. She crossed it without hurrying, without the expression of a woman in pursuit of anything. She had learned long ago that the fastest way to become invisible in a room full of aristocrats was to move with deliberate calm, because aristocrats were trained to respond to disruption and trained to ignore everything else. She was ignored. The entrance hall was empty except for Harwick, the Rowan family's senior butler, who stood near the door with his hands clasped behind his back and his face arranged into the expression of a man who has witnessed something. He will spend the remainder of his professional life pretending he did not see. The front door was standing open. Not wide open, just open. The specific width of a door that someone has passed through recently and not troubled themselves to close. Vivian walked to it and stood in the gap. The night was cold. February in the capital meant a cold that had no patience for ceremony, that came in off the northern hills and pushed through whatever you were wearing, regardless of how many layers you'd put on. The torches along the front drive threw orange light across the gravel, and the line of carriages waiting at the far end, horses standing in the cold with the particular stillness of animals accustomed to waiting for human beings to finish ruining things. One of the carriages was not waiting. It was positioned halfway down the drive, and it did not belong to the Rowan household. Vivian knew every vehicle in their carriage house. It was a private conveyance, the kind that wealthy people used when they did not want to be identified. Plain black lacquering, no house crest on the door. The window was partially lowered, and Cedric was standing at that window, one hand braced against the carriage door, leaning in, speaking to someone inside with an urgency that was nothing at all like the man who had just told 300 people he would return momentarily. Vivian could not hear the words. She could hear his voice, the register of it, the pace. She had never in 2 years heard Cedric speak to her in that register. There was something raw in it, something that sounded like the underside of the man she had married, stripped of every social grace he'd spent his life constructing. He was pleading. Lord Cedric Rowan, who had never in his life asked for anything he did not receive, was pressing his forehead against the lacquered door of a black carriage and begging someone inside it not to leave. Then a woman's hand appeared through the window, pale, gloved, slender. It settled against the side of Cedric's face with a familiarity that told Vivian everything she needed to know about the history she had not been invited into. Cedric turned his head and pressed his lips against the gloved palm, and the quality of that gesture, the desperation in it, the way it contradicted everything Vivian had ever understood about who her husband was, felt like something breaking inside her chest, though she was too controlled to let it show on her face. She stood in the doorway for exactly as long as it took her to understand what she was looking at. Then she turned around and walked back inside. Harwick was still standing near the door. He looked at her once, quickly, and she watched him make the calculation that most servants made in these situations, the calculation between truth and survival. She saved him the effort. "Send for my wrap," she said. "I'll need it within the hour." "My lady," he said. Nothing else. She returned to the banquet hall. The party was continuing. Of course it was continuing. Parties of this scale had a momentum entirely independent of whatever personal catastrophe was unfolding within them, a social gravity that pulled guests toward the champagne and away from anything that might require them to make difficult choices about where their loyalties lay. Vivian took a fresh glass from a passing tray and positioned herself near the windows that overlooked the drive. She could see the black carriage from here. It hadn't moved. Lady Margot materialized at her elbow, slightly flushed from her third glass of something sparkling, and resumed speaking about the renovation of her husband's country estate as though the last 10 minutes had not occurred. Vivian listened. She made the appropriate responses at the appropriate intervals. She was extremely good at this, at the parallel processing of social performance and interior devastation, at standing inside a burning building and commenting pleasantly on the architecture. She had been doing it for most of her marriage. What she was feeling, standing at that window, was not what she would have expected. There was grief in it, yes. The specific grief of a woman who has spent 2 years telling herself that a marriage would become something it had never been, who has negotiated with reality on a daily basis and finally run out of terms to offer. But underneath the grief was something colder and more clarifying, something that felt less like an emotion and more like a diagnosis. She had been wrong about Cedric Rowan. Not about his character, she had never had particularly many illusions about that, but about the nature of her position relative to him. She had believed on some fundamental level that she mattered enough to be protected, that whatever else he would not destroy her publicly. She had been wrong. The black carriage finally moved. It turned at the end of the drive and rolled out through the gates, and Vivian tracked it until the torchlight no longer reached it, and it disappeared into the dark of the city street. Cedric did not reappear for 40 minutes. By the time he walked back into the banquet hall, the evening had shifted. The way evenings do when something unseen has contaminated them, when the people present know on some animal level that the ground beneath the party has changed, but cannot identify what changed or how. Conversations had grown slightly louder, the laughter slightly more effortful. Vivian recognized it. She had seen it at events before, that particular social strain of people working harder than they should have to maintain a reality that was quietly coming apart. Cedric entered with his collar correctly arranged and his expression restored to its habitual ease, and Vivian watched him scan the room until he found her, and she watched the specific moment when he registered that she was watching him back. He crossed the room. "Crisis averted," he said, with the smile he reserved for situations that required him to charm his way through damage. "An estate matter. Forgive the absence." Ilara Voss, Vivian said. She said it the way someone states a fact. Not a question, not an accusation, just a word placed carefully in the air between them to see what it would do. Cedric's smile didn't disappear, but it lost its certainty for a fraction of a second, the way a flame responds to air, and that fraction of a second was all Vivian needed. I don't know what you said. Don't, she said. The word was quiet. It was not angry. It was the word of someone who has decided that a particular conversation has no viable outcomes and is cutting it off before it wastes any more of her time. Cedric looked at her for a long moment. Around them, 300 people continued performing the social theater of celebrating a marriage. Someone laughed loudly at the far end of the hall. Crystal clinked. The white dahlias stood in their towers, exactly as she'd ordered them. Vivian, he said. His voice had dropped below its social register, and what was underneath it was not apology. Nothing so generous as that. What was underneath it was the specific discomfort of a man who has been discovered doing something he knew was wrong and has realized that the cost of discovery will be higher than he calculated. This is not the moment. What moment would you prefer? She asked. Because I've been waiting for you to choose the right moment for approximately 2 years, Cedric, and I've begun to suspect no such moment exists. He did not answer. She was crying, Vivian said, when you pressed your mouth to her hand. Was that because she'd decided to leave or because you'd asked her to wait? The color that moved through Cedric Rowan's face was something she had never seen there before. It was not anger. It was not even guilt, precisely. It was the look of a man confronted with a version of himself he preferred not to examine. The look of someone accustomed to managing the perceptions of everyone in his life, discovering that one of those people had stopped being manageable. You watched, he said. I was standing in my own doorway, she said. This isn't... He stopped, gathered himself. The charm reassembled itself with the practiced speed of a man who had been relying on it since childhood. I will explain everything. Tonight, after... No, Vivian said. You won't. She set down her champagne glass with a care that bordered on ceremonial and looked at her husband of exactly 9 hours with the expression of someone who has finished conducting an assessment and arrived at a conclusion she would have preferred not to reach. I understand the situation, she said. I think I've understood it for longer than I've admitted to myself. What I need from you now, the only thing I need from you now, is to not make this worse than it already is. Vivian, go back to your guests, she said. Smile at them. Pour yourself another glass. You're very good at all of that. I'm going to need a few minutes. She walked away from him before he could form another sentence. The side corridor was empty. Vivian walked until the noise of the party fell to a murmur behind the closed door, and she was standing in a stretch of dark hallway between a portrait of Cedric's grandfather and a window that looked out onto the kitchen garden. She stood there for a while. The cold came through the glass. The kitchen garden below was bare and dark, the bed stripped for winter, the soil frozen into rigid geometry. She did not cry. She considered it. The weight in her chest was the precise weight of tears, she recognized that much. But there was something in the recognition of it that made crying feel like a concession she was unwilling to make. Not to Cedric. Not to the situation. Not to herself. She had spent 2 years making concessions, adjusting her expectations downward by careful increments until she had reached a kind of floor that she'd told herself was solid. And now the floor was gone and she was falling. But she was falling with her spine straight and her face composed, and she intended to continue doing so until she hit whatever came next. What she needed now was not comfort. What she needed was a decision. She turned that over in her mind the way she turned over all problems of this nature, methodically, without attachment to any particular outcome, testing each option against what she actually knew about her position. She was Vivian Ashcroft by name, Vivian Rowan, as of 9 hours ago. And what that name now represented was not the thing she had understood it to represent this morning, when she woke up in her father's house still vibrating with the particular terror of a woman about to change her life. What it represented was a catastrophe with excellent floral arrangements. She could stay. She knew what staying looked like. She had watched women do it her entire life, the quiet renegotiation of the self, the performance of a contentment that was really just the absence of alternatives, The slow fossilization of someone who had once expected more from the world than the world had seen fit to offer. She knew how to do it. She was even, in a certain terrible way, prepared for it. But the image of Cedric's mouth against Ilara Voss's gloved hand returned to her with the accuracy of a blade finding the precise point it was aimed at, and she understood that the thing she had told herself she was prepared to endure was different from the thing she was actually being asked to endure. And the difference was this: she had been prepared to be unloved. She had not been prepared to be discarded in front of 300 people on the night they'd promised her she would be most protected. She was still standing at the window when she heard footsteps. They were not Cedric's footsteps. She knew his walk well enough by now. The particular confidence of a man who moved through spaces as though he had already been told he was allowed there. These footsteps were slower, deliberate, carrying a kind of weight that was not heaviness but density. The walk of someone who has learned over a long life to move with the exact force required and nothing beyond it. She turned. Duke Alistair Blackthorne had not spoken to her once during the evening. He had been seated at the secondary table. The placement itself was a minor insult. She'd registered it at the time without comment, the kind of passive diminishment that Cedric's mother was expert in. And she had seen him from a distance as she'd navigated the room, registered his presence the way one registers any significant object in a space without engaging it directly. He was older than the other guests, and the room had organized itself around him in the way that rooms organize around things that do not require acknowledgement to be significant. People had given him space without apparently meaning to. Now he was standing in the corridor. He was not a tall man, though he carried himself in a way that made the question of height irrelevant. He had the particular build of someone who had once been extremely dangerous and had since allowed time to settle its adjustments on him, so that what remained was not diminished but concentrated, something dense and difficult to read, the way certain minerals look unremarkable until the light hits them at the right angle. His hair was gray-silver, trimmed without vanity. The lines in his face had not been installed by time alone. Some of them were older than that, the kind that come from decisions made in circumstances where the wrong choice had permanent consequences. His eyes, looking at her in the dim corridor, were the color of deep water in winter. Not cold exactly, but serious in the way that depth is always serious. "Your Grace," Vivian said. Her voice was steady. She was grateful for that. "I apologize for the intrusion," he said. His voice was quiet and precise, carrying just enough volume for the space they were in, no excess. "I saw you leave the room. I thought you might prefer company that wouldn't require anything from you." Vivian looked at him. She was practiced at reading social approaches, at identifying what people wanted from her when they pretended to be offering something, and she spent a moment running his words through that filter. What she found was unexpected. He appeared to mean it exactly as stated. "That's a specific kind of company to offer," she said. "It's a specific kind of evening," he said. She studied him for a moment. He did not seem uncomfortable under the examination. Most men became uncomfortable when she looked at them directly and with assessment. They either became aggressive or overly accommodating, two responses that were functionally the same thing, and that both were about managing their own discomfort rather than engaging with her. Alistair Blackthorne simply held her gaze with an evenness that suggested he had no particular investment in what she concluded. "You were watching the room," she said. It was not a question. "I'm always watching the room," he said. "It's a habit, expensive to break after a certain age." "What did you see?" He was quiet for a moment, not hesitating. She could tell the difference between a man thinking and a man stalling, but actually considering what to say. "I saw a woman," he said, "spend an entire evening performing a role she'd been assigned without asking for it, while the person who assigned it to her indulged himself without the basic courtesy of keeping it invisible." He paused. "I also saw her carry herself through that with more composure than the situation deserved, and more than most people would have managed." Vivian was silent. There was something in the bluntness of it that she hadn't prepared for. The evening had given her an unbroken stream of euphemism, of sidelong looks and carefully incomplete sentences, of Cedric's charm and Margot's chattiness, and the crowd's collective decision to be very interested in their champagne, and the absence of all that in Blackthorne's two short sentences had the quality of stepping from a crowded room into cold air. "Why are you here?" she asked. "At this event. Cedric has never spoken of you as—" "I was invited by the Earl of Voss," he said. "A standing courtesy. The Earl and I share certain professional histories that make periodic contact useful to both of us." The Earl of Voss. Vivian processed that quietly. Alara Voss, the Earl's daughter. The woman in the black carriage. She filed this away without expression. "Then you know her," Vivian said. "Alara." "I know who she is," he said. There was a precision to the distinction that she noticed, which is not the same thing. From the far end of the corridor, behind the closed door, she could hear the party gaining momentum again. Someone had apparently arranged for musicians, and a low current of stringed instruments had begun threading through the general noise. The white dahlias would still be standing in their towers. Cedric would be back at the center of the room, doing what Cedric did best, which was inhabit a social space with such fluency that people forgot to question what they'd witnessed. "What happens now?" Vivian said, and she was not asking him exactly. She was asking the corridor, the evening, the specific architecture of the situation she was standing inside. "Is that I return to that room, and we complete the remainder of the evening as though nothing occurred, and tomorrow the story will be told in drawing rooms across the capital in whatever way serves the people telling it, and I will be the woman who didn't notice or the woman who chose to ignore it, and either version will accomplish the same thing." "What thing is that?" Blackthorn asked. "It will make me a lesson," she said. "A useful example of what happens when a woman overestimates her position." He was quiet for a moment. "Or," he said, "you make a different decision." She looked at him. "I've had this conversation before," she said carefully, "with people who believed they were offering me options when what they were actually offering me was a version of the same problem in different packaging. I need you to be clear about what you mean by that." "I mean exactly what I said," he told her. "You can make a different decision, tonight, before the evening ends, in front of every person in that room." The musicians had shifted to something slower. The cold came through the window glass in waves. "That requires a decision to make," she said. "Yes," he said. "It does." He did not elaborate. He stood in the corridor with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that most conversations worth having required the other person to arrive at their own terms before they could receive anything that was being offered. Vivian stood opposite him and conducted the fastest and most consequential audit of her own situation that she had ever attempted. Her family name was Ashcroft. Solid enough? Her father was a respected figure in the merchant nobility class that occupied the interesting gray territory between old money and new, respected without being aristocratically significant. Her personal fortune was adequate. She had managed her own finances with more discipline than her father had managed his, and she had not been stupid enough to transfer everything to Cedric upon marriage. She had that, at least. Her reputation was, as of 9 hours ago, the reputation of a woman who had married well. And as of approximately the last 40 minutes, the reputation of a woman whose marriage had begun dissolving on the night it was constructed. What she did not have was the kind of position that made a dignified exit possible. The empire's social architecture was extremely specific about what happened to women who left marriages without the correct structural support. The narrative would assemble itself quickly and without her input, and the narrative would not be flattering. Unless she controlled the narrative, and control required leverage. She looked at Alistair Blackthorn. She knew what she knew about him, which was limited. He had been one of the Empire's principal military commanders during the border conflicts of 20 years ago, decorated beyond what the official records publicly specified, the kind of figure who had been important enough to be celebrated and inconvenient enough that celebration had eventually given way to a comfortable social obscurity that served everyone involved. He lived in the north. He had a duchy that she understood was either neglected or deliberately underplayed. The accounts were contradictory. He was a widower. He had no children. He was old enough to be her father, which in the current context was irrelevant to everything that mattered. "You're proposing a marriage," she said. "I'm telling you one is possible," he said. "If you want it, on terms that are yours to specify." "You'd do this tonight," she said. "In front of it." "Tonight," he said. "If that's what serves you. By morning, the Empire would have a different story." Not a pleasant story, perhaps, but a story that ends with you as a duchess rather than as a cautionary tale. Vivian was very still. There was a calculation to be made here, and she was making it, running the numbers on dignity, on position, on what the word duchess actually meant in the geography of this empire's power structure, on what it meant for a woman of her specific situation to enter a marriage of declared convenience with a man whose social position, however obscured by time and distance, remained structurally significant. She was also running a different calculation, quieter, that had less to do with strategy and more to do with the corridor itself, with the fact that this man had come to find her and told her the truth, without ornament, without agenda she could detect, and offered her something real in a night that had contained nothing but performance. "What do you want from it?" she asked. Honestly, he said, with a faint shift in expression that might, in a different light, have been the outline of something wry. "I want someone capable of managing an estate that has been mismanaged for 15 years. I want a household that functions. I want a professional partner who can think." He paused. "And I find I've grown tired of being treated as though my age makes me invisible, which it turns out is its own particular irritation." She almost smiled at that. "That's more honest than I expected," she said. "I found," he said, "that honesty at the beginning of an arrangement saves a considerable amount of damage later." From behind the door at the end of the corridor, the music shifted again, and she heard Cedric's laugh. That particular laugh he produced for public consumption, full and assured, the laugh of a man who was very good at taking up space. She'd spent 2 years finding that laugh attractive. Now it sounded like something hollow, pretending to be solid. She looked at Alistair Blackthorne. She thought about her mother, who had stayed in a marriage that offered her nothing because the alternative was the unknown, and had spent the remainder of her life being expertly preserved by unhappiness. She thought about the 40 minutes she'd stood at the window watching a black carriage at the end of a drive, and the specific quality of what it had felt like to understand that the person who was supposed to be on her side had constructed his entire relationship with her as a side arrangement. She thought about the word duchess and what it meant and what it cost and what it purchased. She thought about the kitchen garden, stripped and frozen below the window, about how things that looked finished in winter were sometimes just resting, about how the same soil that looked abandoned in February produced something in April that was unrecognizable as the same ground. "All right," she said. Alistair Blackthorne looked at her steadily. "You're certain." "I was certain approximately 3 minutes into this conversation," she said. "I've spent the last several minutes confirming it." Something shifted in his face. Not surprise, but something that might have been, from a man less controlled than he appeared to be, a form of recognition. "Then we should return to the room," he said. "Yes," she said. "We should." They walked back down the corridor toward the sound of 300 people performing an evening that was about to become something none of them had prepared for. She opened the door. The light hit her first. The chandelier light of Rowan House, the light she had specified in consultation with Cedric's household manager over the course of several irritating weeks, warm and directional, designed to make the white dahlias glow. It did exactly that. They stood in their towers as she'd ordered them, perfect and indifferent, and the room spread out before her with its full complement of guests, and its low current of strings, and its champagne, and its careful social performance. And she stood in the doorway for exactly 1 breath. Then Alistair Blackthorne stepped up beside her, and she placed her hand on his arm, and they walked into the room together. It took approximately 6 seconds for the room to notice. Not everyone noticed simultaneously. The wave of awareness moved from nearest the door outward, conversation pausing in clusters as people registered what they were seeing, which was Vivian Rowan returning from wherever she'd gone with the Duke of Blackthorne at her side, and something on her face that was not distress, and was not performance, and was, if they were reading it correctly, and most of them were, a kind of decision. Cedric found her across the room. She watched his expression cycle through several things in rapid succession. Confusion, assessment, something that was almost amusement at the impossibility of what he thought he was reading, and then, as she held his gaze without flinching, the first clean note of alarm. She walked with Blackthorne to the center of the room. The strings stopped. Or rather, the musicians, who were skilled at reading rooms, allowed the piece they were playing to reach a natural resting point and held there. Lady Margot, who was nearest and had the social instincts of an apex predator, was the first to understand that something was happening. She was also, conveniently, the most efficient vehicle for information in the capital's aristocratic circuit, which was why Vivian looked at her specifically when she spoke. "I have an announcement," Vivian said. Her voice carried the room without effort. She had never needed to shout to be heard. She had learned early that the trick was not volume, but certainty. The specific frequency of a voice that knows exactly what it is saying and has already accepted the consequences of saying it. 300 faces turned toward her, Cedric's face among them, still cycling, still attempting to read what this was before it became irreversible. "Lord Rowan and I have agreed," Vivian said, with the particular cadence of someone issuing a diplomatic document, "that our marriage was contracted under misunderstandings that served neither party well. As of this evening, we have arranged for an annulment." She paused for exactly the duration required. "I am pleased to announce my betrothal to His Grace, the Duke of Blackthorn, whose proposal I am honored to accept." The room did not explode. Rooms like this never exploded. They absorbed, they processed, and then they reoriented themselves around the new information with the smoothness of water filling a new container. But the absorption itself had a quality she could feel, a collective intake of breath so coordinated it was almost architectural, the sound of 300 people simultaneously rearranging everything they thought they knew about the evening. She felt Blackthorn's arm steady beneath her hand. She looked at Cedric. His face had finally settled into something single and coherent, and what it had settled into was an expression she had never seen on him before. It was not anger. It was not the smooth recovery she had expected. It was something rawer than either of those. The expression of a man who has understood, perhaps for the first time, that he has made a miscalculation significant enough to have permanent consequences. He was looking at her the way you look at something when you realize you have irrevocably misidentified what it was. Vivian held his gaze. There was a time, earlier in this same evening, standing at the entrance watching the carriage at the end of the drive, when she had felt the weight of grief with enough force that she'd almost lost her footing. She didn't feel it now. What she felt now was something cleaner and colder, a current of something that was not revenge and was not triumph, but was perhaps what both of those things were pointing toward when they grew up. The specific sensation of having made a choice that was entirely your own. The room was already beginning to realign. She could see it happening. The small restructuring of social formations, the conversations collapsing and reassembling around the new arrangement, Margot already leaning toward the woman beside her with the expression of someone who has just been handed material of extraordinary value. The Duke of Blackthorn at Vivian's side was still and quiet, and the room was giving him the space it always gave him, that unconscious clearance that significant things generate without demanding it. Lady Hargrove, the Empire's most senior noble matriarch currently present, crossed the floor toward them. She was 73 years old and had survived 4 emperors and 3 revolutions in the Empire's political structure, and she moved through a crowd the way glaciers move through landscape, slowly, and in a way that permanently altered the geography. "My dear," she said to Vivian, and her voice carried the specific frequency of a woman who has seen so much of human behavior that almost none of it surprises her, which made the faint note of approval in it more significant than any enthusiasm could have been. "You have given us an extraordinary evening." "Thank you, my lady," Vivian said. Lady Hargrove looked at Blackthorn. Something passed between them, the kind of look exchanged by people with shared history who have no need to speak it aloud. "Alistair," she said. "Evelyn," he said. The matriarch turned back to Vivian. "You chose well," she said. It was not a compliment in the conventional sense. It was something more like an assessment delivered by someone with the standing to make it. She moved away, back into the current of the room. Vivian became gradually aware that people were approaching. Not the approach of predators, not yet, but the approach of people recalibrating their alliances, calculating whether to be first to offer congratulations, weighing what the Duchess of Blackthorn was worth as a social connection against the cost of whatever they'd formerly offered Cedric Rowan. She watched it happen with the detachment of someone observing a mechanism she understood. "You should know," Blackthorn said quietly at her side, not looking at her, his gaze moving across the room with the practiced neutrality of a man who had spent decades reading landscapes for threats, "that this will be considerably more complicated tomorrow." "I know," she said. "The duchy is in worse shape than the public accounts suggest," he said. "I've been deliberate about that. The people who believe it is failing serve a function. The reality is different." She filed this away. "How different?" "Different enough that the work will be substantial," he said. "If you are what I think you are, it will also be interesting." She looked at him then. He met her gaze with the same evenness he'd brought to the corridor. No performance in it, no charm, nothing designed to secure her approval. Just the look of a man who meant what he said and was accustomed to operating in conditions where that was sufficient. "I'll need to understand the accounts," she said. "I'll have them ready for you by the end of the week," he said. "And the estate staff, their status, their history, everything," he said. "Whatever you need." Vivian looked out across the room. The white dahlias stood in their towers. The champagne continued flowing. 300 people were performing an evening that had become entirely different from the one any of them had arrived expecting, and she stood at the center of it with her hand on the arm of a man she had known for 40 minutes and whom she had agreed to marry before morning. Somewhere across the room, Cedric Rowan was having a conversation she could not hear. He was not looking at her anymore. She thought, this is what the beginning of something looks like. Not the beginning she had planned, not the one she had arranged the flowers for. Something rawer than that, something without the comfort of a script or the softness of anticipation. The beginning that comes after the end, that comes earlier than expected, when the ground has gone out from under you and you discover that you can fall and continue falling and keep your spine straight the whole way down, and that the falling itself teaches you something about what you are capable of that standing securely in place never could. She did not know yet what Alistair Blackthorne was. She knew what he had offered and how he had offered it. She knew that he had found her in a corridor and told her the truth and given her the space to make her own decision, and that those were not nothing. She knew that tomorrow she would be the Empire's greatest scandal, and she knew that the day after tomorrow she intended to begin working. The evening wore on. The room moved around them. At some point, a photographer arrived, someone's indulgence, the fashionable habit of the capital's new generation of nobles, and was directed away by Blackthorne's single quiet gesture. The champagne was replaced by something darker, heavier, a burgundy that someone in the Rowan household had selected for the later hours when the party was meant to have deepened into intimacy. It was close to midnight when the first of the guests began the choreography of departure, the extended goodbyes and carriage calls, the specific social ballet of people extracting themselves from a gathering they would be analyzing for weeks. Vivian stood through it. She accepted every offer of congratulations with the same even courtesy, committed nothing, gave nothing away. Beside her, Blackthorne did the same. Cedric left without speaking to her. She saw him go, the broad shoulders of the man she had married 9 hours ago moving through the crowd toward the door with a velocity that was trying hard to look like nonchalance and failing. He did not stop, did not turn. The door closed behind him. She thought she should feel something specific about that. She would, probably, later. Tonight she felt only the clean forward pull of a decision already made. It was nearing 1 a.m. when Blackthorne turned to her for the first time since they had re-entered the room together, and his voice was low enough that only she could hear it. "My carriage can take you wherever you need to go tonight," he said. "Your father's house, a hotel, wherever is most useful to you." "Thank you," she said. "The solicitors can begin drafting in the morning," he said. "The annulment should proceed quickly. Cedric will want it as clean as possible. The betrothal documentation. I'll need to review it before signing anything," she said. "Of course," he said. It was said without hesitation, with the same quality of absolute acceptance that she had noticed in the corridor, and she noted it again now. The absence of negotiation or performance around something that most men would have managed carefully. They stood in the thinning room. "Your Grace," she said. "Alistair," he said. "If we're going to do this, I'd prefer you use my name." She considered that. "Alistair," she said. "Yes?" She looked at the dahlias, at the chandelier light, at the empty spaces where 300 people had been performing the Empire's most extraordinary evening and were now trickling out into the cold city with all of it packed inside them for transport to wherever they went next. Is there anything, she said carefully, about this arrangement that you believe I should know tonight that I don't already know? He was quiet for a long moment. Yes, he said, though I think it will keep until morning. She looked at him. That's not reassuring. It isn't meant to be reassuring, he said. It's meant to be honest. Vivian held his gaze. She thought, there is something in this man that I have not yet seen. Something he has not shown me. Something about the duchy, the accounts, the 15 years of deliberate obscurity, the specific way the room cleared space for him without being asked to. Something about the Earl of Voss, and the invitation that brought Blackthorn here tonight, and the look that had passed between him and Lady Hargrove. She had 40 minutes of information and a decision made on that 40 minutes, and whatever she had missed in the gap between what she knew and what he'd told her was out there in the dark of the city night, waiting for morning. All right, she said. Tomorrow. He nodded. Outside, through the tall windows, the winter city was quiet. The drive was empty. The torches had begun to gutter. She was thinking about tomorrow, about the solicitors and the accounts and the duchy in the north, about what she did not yet know and what she would shortly be required to learn, about the particular silence of a life that has just changed direction so completely that even the air around you seems uncertain for a moment what you are. She was thinking about all of this when her eye caught a movement outside. A carriage in the street. Not the drive. The street beyond the gate, stopped at the curb. A plain black carriage, the same she had watched from the window hours ago, and it was facing Rowan House, and in the window, barely visible in the lamplight from the street, a figure was watching the last light burning in the entrance hall. And beside that figure, just visible, barely more than a silhouette, was another shape. Cedric Rowan's silhouette, recognizable after 2 years even at distance and through night glass. He had come back. Not to the party, not to her. He had come back and parked in the street and was sitting in the window of a black carriage belonging to another woman, watching the house where his marriage had ended, and what his face might have looked like from here Vivian could not determine, but the fact of the carriage sitting there in the dark had an unmistakable quality to it. The quality of someone who has finally understood the consequence of a decision and arrived too late to reverse it. Vivian stood at the window. She did not move toward the door. She did not look away. And then, from somewhere in the interior of Blackthorn Manor's documentation, delivered to her hand by a solicitor's runner who appeared in the entrance hall at 1:10 in the morning with the punctuality of someone who had been prepared for exactly this contingency, came a sealed envelope bearing the ducal crest of House Blackthorn, and on the outside of it, in handwriting that was precise and unornamental. For the Duchess. Before morning. She broke the seal. Inside was not the expected legal preamble, not the draft of a betrothal agreement, not a list of terms. It was a single sheet of paper, and on it, in the same handwriting, a name she recognized. A name from the Empire's financial records, from the capital's most protected corridors of commerce, a name that connected to 3 of the most powerful houses currently operating in the imperial court. Below the name, 2 lines only. They know what we did tonight. They will not wait. The note was still in her hand when the carriage outside moved. She watched it from the window, the plain black conveyance pulling away from the curb with the particular unhurried motion of something that had accomplished its purpose simply by being seen. Cedric's silhouette disappeared with it, swallowed by the dark geometry of the capital's winter streets, and Vivian stood at the glass with the single sheet of paper and its 2 lines of handwriting, and understood that she had approximately 6 hours before morning arrived, and whatever they will not wait meant became something she would have to manage without having slept. She read the note again. The name on the page was Harlan Voss, not Alara, the father, the Earl. She had met him twice, formal occasions, the kind where everyone was performing a version of themselves calibrated for maximum social utility. She remembered a man of perhaps 60 who carried his authority the way men carry things they've owned so long they've stopped noticing the weight. Pleasant in the specific way that very powerful men are pleasant when they have no reason yet to be otherwise. She had not, at either meeting, understood him to be the kind of man whose name would appear at the top of a page delivered by ducal runner at 1 in the morning as a warning. She was revising that assessment. She folded the note and put it in the pocket of her gown and found Harwick still standing near the entrance, now engaged in the mechanical process of supervising the party's dissolution. "I need to send a message," she said. He looked at her with the face of a man who had survived an extraordinary evening through the application of professional neutrality and intended to continue doing so. "Of course, my lady." She wrote 4 words on a card from Harwick's desk. "Received. Dawn, then." She sealed it and gave it to the runner who was still waiting near the door, with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting in cold entrance halls at unreasonable hours. And she watched him go without asking how he knew where to take it, because she understood already that Alistair Blackthorne had arranged for exactly this contingency and that the runner knew precisely where to go. This told her something about how the man operated. She filed it with everything else she was still building. The carriage he had offered took her to her father's house, where she arrived at 1:30 to find the staff still awake. The news had preceded her, because news of this specific velocity always preceded the people it was about. And her father standing in the entrance hall in his dressing gown, with the expression of a man who has heard something so far outside the range of scenarios he had prepared for that his face hasn't yet decided what to do about it. "Vivian," he said. "I'm fine," she said. "You—" He stopped. He looked at her face. Her father was a practical man, which was both his limitation and his most useful quality, and he read her face now with the accuracy of a man who had raised her alone and knew the specific geography of her expressions better than anyone living. "You've made a decision," he said. "Several," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Blackthorne," he said. "Yes." "I know how old he is," she said. "I also know what he offered and how he offered it, and I need you to trust that I've done the arithmetic on this more carefully than anyone else in the Empire is going to give me credit for." Her father looked at her for a long time. "All right," he said finally. It was the thing she had always valued most about him, that he knew when he had reached the limit of his jurisdiction. "All right, come in. There's still something hot in the kitchen." She slept for 3 hours. It was not good sleep, the kind that restores things, but the kind that simply interrupts the forward pressure of thought long enough for the body to run its maintenance. She was awake before the light came and dressed before the household was fully moving, and she was standing in the front room with a cup of coffee, going cold in her hand when the Blackthorne carriage arrived at 6 in the morning. He was already inside it. He looked, if anything, as though he had not slept at all, not in the haggard sense, but in the sense of a man who had spent the night hours doing something productive that didn't require consciousness to be interrupted for. "You read it," he said when she settled across from him. "Yes. Tell me about Harlan Voss." He looked at her for a moment. The same assessing quality she had encountered in the corridor, the look of a man recalibrating what a person can absorb. Then he appeared to make a decision, and the decision was to tell her the truth without managing it. "Harlan Voss has spent 15 years building a financial network that operates alongside the Empire's legitimate commerce," he said. "Not against it, alongside. He is not a criminal in any simple sense. He is a man who understood early that the Empire's most important decisions are made by whoever controls the flow of credit, and he has positioned himself accordingly." "And you," she said. "I know where the bodies are buried," he said. "Metaphorically. Mostly." "Mostly." Something shifted in his face. "The border conflicts," he said. 20 years ago, Voss provided financing on both sides of the Aldenmere campaign. Legal, technically. Profitable, certainly. The kind of thing that gets buried in the records of a war that everyone would prefer to remember differently." He paused. "I know the documentation exists. He has always known I know. We have maintained a productive distance based on mutual understanding." "Until last night," she said. "Until last night," he agreed. She thought about this. The carriage moved through the capital's morning streets, the city assembling itself for another day with the industrious indifference of a place that has seen too many scandals to be derailed by any single one of them. "He'll move against us," she said. "Not violently, financially." "That would be my expectation," Blackthorne said, "which means the duchy needs to be in better shape than he believes it is before he makes his move," she said. "How long do we have?" "Weeks, possibly. A month, if we're careful." Then I need the accounts today, she said. All of them, not a summary. The actual ledgers. He studied her. You can read estate ledgers? My father taught me bookkeeping before he taught me how to ride, she said. He believed it was the more useful skill. I've come to agree with him. Something happened in Alistair Blackthorne's expression that she hadn't seen there before. It wasn't surprise exactly. He struck her as a man who had controlled his responses to surprise for so long that the response itself had been largely decommissioned. But there was something, a recalibration of some internal assessment, quiet and complete. The accounts will be waiting at the manor, he said. Good, she said. We leave today? Unless you need more time. Time, she said, appears to be the one thing we don't have. They were married 3 days later. Not at a cathedral, not with 300 guests and imported flowers and a string quartet. A civil ceremony, witnessed by her father and Lady Hargrove, who appeared with the punctuality of someone who had been waiting for the invitation without being told to expect it. Vivian wore a dress the color of slate. Blackthorne wore the same kind of austere formal wear she had seen him in at Rowan House, and he spoke his vows with the same absence of performance that characterized everything else he did. And she spoke hers with the same precision, and when it was done, they were married and the carriage was waiting and they drove north to the duchy that everyone in the capital believed was falling apart. The capital, as it turned out, was not entirely wrong. Blackthorne Manor arrived in her life the way certain truths arrive, not in a single revelation, but in accumulating detail, each new piece of information adjusting the shape of the whole. The manor itself was vast and genuinely neglected in the cosmetic sense, the kind of neglect that looked, from outside, like collapse, and revealed itself on closer inspection to be selective. The bones of the place were sound. The structural investments had been made and maintained with an attention that someone with eyes only for the surface would never detect. It was, Vivian understood on her third morning there, deliberately disguised. You've been performing poverty, she said to Alistair at breakfast. He set down his coffee. I've been performing mediocrity, he said. Poverty would have attracted a different kind of attention. 14 years of this? 15, he said. Since Aldenmere. She thought about what that meant. The sustained effort of it, the discipline required to maintain a performance of diminishment across a decade and a half, to accept the social diminishment that came with it, to allow people to treat you as irrelevant while continuing to be anything but. She thought about the kind of patience that required and what it said about the man who had managed it. The Western estates, she said, the accounts show them running at a loss. They appear to, he said. They're not. No. She had been in the ledgers for 48 hours by this point, working in the room he had designated as her study with a fire going and coffee arriving at intervals managed by Mrs. Alderton, the housekeeper, who had revised her initial wariness of the new Duchess downward after approximately 6 hours of observing how Vivian operated. The accounts were in a state that looked at first pass like genuine mismanagement, and then, on the second pass, like something a great deal more intentional. Income routed through shell structures, productive land carried on the books at a fraction of its actual yield, investments buried in subsidiary accounts under names that would have meant nothing to any auditor who didn't know exactly what to look for. Vivian had taken 12 pages of notes. You've been hiding a fortune, she said. I've been protecting an asset, he said, from people who would have moved against it if they'd understood its scale. And now? He looked at her across the breakfast table. The morning light came through the manor's high windows and lay across the space between them with the particular quality of winter light in the north, thin and direct. She had been in this house for 4 days. She had not yet understood what she'd married into. She was beginning to. Now, he said, I have someone who can help me build something with it. She looked at him for a long moment. You planned this, she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a recognition. I recognize an opportunity, he said. There's a difference. At the Rowan wedding, before the Rowan wedding, he said, I've been aware of your situation for some time. Your financial management, your father's accounts, which you've handled on his behalf for the last 4 years, your capacity for discretion. He paused. I didn't engineer what Cedric did. But when it happened, I understood what it opened. Vivian absorbed this. She thought about the corridor, the offer, the 2 lines of the note, and the name above them. She ran the full architecture of that evening back through her memory with this new information installed. And the thing that came out the other side was not anger. She had moved past the territory where easy anger was available to her, but a clean and unsparing recognition of the situation she was inside. "You should know," she said, "that I won't be managed." "I know," he said, "and that if I discover you've concealed something material, something that affects my position, my decisions, my ability to protect what I'm now responsible for, I will treat that as a breach." "That's reasonable," he said. "I'm not asking for your assessment of whether it's reasonable," she said. "I'm telling you how I operate." Something moved through his face. She had started to read him, the way you start to read someone who expresses very little, learning the grammar of small shifts, a tension around the eyes. The slight adjustment of his posture that she was beginning to understand corresponded to something he recognized and respected. "Understood," he said. The months that followed were the hardest work she had ever done. Not because it was beyond her. She had grown up in the belief, absorbed from her father's kitchen table arithmetic lessons, that the distance between financial ruin and recovery was almost always a question of will and method rather than intelligence. And she had both. But because the scale of what Blackthorne had been concealing was larger than she'd initially grasped, and as she began the process of carefully, invisibly restructuring the duchy's public-facing accounts into something that could begin converting hidden assets into operational income without triggering the attention of the Voss network, she understood that she was doing something that required not just competence, but precision. She hired 3 estate managers in the first month, replacing men who had been loyal to the fiction rather than to the function. She negotiated directly with the tenants of the Western estates, sitting across tables from farmers who had not had a meaningful conversation with anyone from the manor house in a decade. And she listened more than she spoke, which was the most important thing she had learned from her father and which she did now by instinct. She drafted correspondence to the Empire's land registry under the Blackthorne seal. She restructured 4 subsidiary accounts and collapsed 3 others into the primary ledger in a way that made the duchy look, from outside, like it was slowly and modestly recovering from long mismanagement, which was exactly the story she needed it to tell, while the real recovery happened beneath the surface. Alistair was present for none of this in a supervisory sense. He watched. He asked questions occasionally in the evenings when they sat in the manor's main room with the fire going and the day's correspondence sorted between them, and the questions he asked were precise and without condescension. The questions of someone who genuinely wanted to understand what she was seeing, not someone testing her. She answered them with the same directness. They did not discuss the arrangement itself. They did not discuss Cedric or the capital or what the drawing rooms of the Empire were presumably saying about them. They discussed the land, the accounts, the tenants, the specific problem of a broken irrigation system on the North Estate that was costing $2,000 a season in lost yield. She found, in this, something she had not expected. Not comfort exactly, but something functionally close to it. The specific satisfaction of a problem that was large enough to require her full capacity and a partner who did not treat that capacity as something to be managed or diminished. She had spent 2 years in a marriage where her intelligence had been received as a form of social inconvenience. She was not accustomed to being in a room with someone who factored it in as a resource. It was on a Thursday evening, 6 weeks into their marriage, when the first word came from the capital. It came in the form of a letter bearing the Voss seal, addressed to Alistair, which he read at the dinner table and passed to her without comment. She read it. It was written in the specific language of men who intend threats and cannot be held legally accountable for them. All courtesy on the surface, the sharp edge visible only to someone who knew what they were looking at. Voss was calling in a debt. A favor, he called it. The language was careful. Related to a particular transaction during the Aldenmere campaign that he believed the Duke would recall and would find it useful to honor at this juncture. The juncture being, specifically, now. He wants you to block the Western land grants, she said. She had reached the 3rd paragraph. He wants me to fail to contest their reassignment, Alistair said. Same thing. Yes. She set the letter down. The fire moved in its grate. Outside, the north wind was doing what it did every evening now, asserting itself against the manor walls with a consistency she had come to find, inexplicably, stabilizing. If those grants are reassigned, she said, we lose approximately a third of the duchy's legitimate public income. Yes. Which collapses the recovery narrative before it has traction. Yes. She looked at him. And if you block the reassignment? He releases documentation, Alistair said. Aldenmere. My signature is on orders that, taken out of the context of a wartime campaign, are difficult to interpret charitably. How difficult? Difficult enough to end a career, he said. Possibly more. She was quiet. This was the thing she had known was coming, the information he had said would keep until morning, on the night at Rowan House. This was the shape of it. Not the specifics, which were still only partially visible to her, but the weight of it. The specific gravity of a man carrying something that could undo him if applied in the right direction by someone who understood exactly how to apply it. She looked at the letter. She thought about Harlan Voss's face at those two social occasions, the pleasant manner of a man who had never been required to show his actual architecture to anyone. She thought about Elara Voss and the black carriage and Cedric kneeling at an open window, and she understood now that these were not separate strands, but the same strand, running through the same hand. She thought about the North Estate, the irrigation, the 12 pages of notes, the 3 estate managers who were right now in the field. He's going to move regardless, she said. Yes, Alistair said. The letter is courtesy, or rather, it's intelligence. He wants to know how I'll respond before he commits to the next step. So we don't respond, she said. Alistair looked at her. We respond, she said, but not to him. We respond to the land registry. First thing tomorrow, we submit the full documentation for the Western Grant continuation, everything properly executed through official channels. We make it an established legal fact before he can move to contest it. He has people in the registry, Alistair said. He has a person, she said. 1. I've been reading the filing history. All the contested transactions in the last 8 years have been processed through a single reviewer, Harrington, in the secondary registration office. She looked at him directly. We go around Harrington. We file through the primary office, which requires a personal appearance from the estate holder or their designated representative. She paused. Me. Tomorrow morning. The silence that followed was not the silence of disagreement. It was the silence of a man processing something faster than he needed to show. Vivian, he said. It was the first time he had said her name at any volume above the formally courteous, and it landed differently than she expected. Not with warmth, exactly, but with a quality of attention that she had not heard directed at her for long enough that she had apparently forgotten what it felt like. If you appear at the registry tomorrow, he said, you are visible. You are no longer someone they're managing at a distance. They will treat you as a principal. I am a principal, she said. What I mean, he said carefully, is that they will respond accordingly. I know what you mean, she said. She picked up the Voss letter. She held it for a moment. Then she set it down, face down, on the table beside her dinner plate. The land grants matter, she said. Everything we've built in 6 weeks depends on those grants holding. If we lose them, the recovery narrative fails and we spend the next 2 years rebuilding from a weaker position. And Voss uses that window to move against the Aldenmere documentation. And then we're managing a crisis instead of building something. She looked at him. I'm not going to allow that. Alistair looked at her for a long time. In the fire's light, his face had the quality she had begun to associate with his moments of most acute attention, stripped of the social surface that even he maintained with habitual efficiency, showing something underneath that was older and less managed. She had seen it twice before, once in the corridor. Once when she had laid out her terms on the morning of their marriage, and he had said understood with a precision that told her he meant it. He was looking at her with it now. All right, he said. I'll need the original grant documentation, she said, and your seal. And I'll need to leave by 6 if I want to reach the city office before Voss's people can mobilize. I'll have everything ready, he said. She nodded. She picked up her fork and returned to the dinner that had been cooling on the plate between them. Because the conversation was finished and there was nothing else to do with the evening except use it. And she had learned in 40 years of watching other people waste time on ceremony that the most reliable advantage you could hold over anyone was the simple willingness to keep moving. She did not look up when Alistair spoke again, quietly, across the table. "You should know," he said, "that when you appear at the registry tomorrow, Voss will know by noon." "Yes," she said. "And when he knows," Alistair said, "everything accelerates." She lifted her eyes from the plate and looked at him directly. And what she felt in that moment, sitting in the dining room of a house she had lived in for 6 weeks, married to a man she had known for less than 2 months, with the letter of a powerful enemy face down on the table between them, was not fear. It was the sensation, clean and cold and utterly without comfort, of a door closing behind her. She had filed the grant documents. She had committed to appearing at the registry in the morning. She had, in a single evening's conversation, transformed herself from a background figure in this conflict into its most visible target. There was no version of tomorrow that did not change everything. "I know," she said. And outside, somewhere in the dark, a rider was already moving south toward the capital. Because Harlan Voss's network did not sleep, and the letter he had sent had been written with the specific confidence of a man who had never once, in 30 years of building power, found himself genuinely surprised by what an opponent did next. He was about to be. She left at 6. The Capitol Road was frozen at that hour, the kind of cold that didn't announce itself but simply occupied everything. The ground, the air, the inside of the carriage, where Vivian sat with the grant documentation in a leather case on the seat beside her, and Alistair's seal wrapped in cloth in her coat pocket. The driver didn't speak. The horses moved through the dark with the steady indifference of animals that had learned not to have opinions about where they were going. She used the 2 hours to go over the documents again. Not because she hadn't already memorized them, she had, down to the surveyor's notations in the margin of the 3rd page, but because the act of reading something a final time before committing to it was a habit she'd developed in her father's study, watching him review contracts with the focused attention of a man who knew that the difference between a good agreement and a catastrophic one was usually a single sentence that looked unremarkable until it wasn't. She'd inherited the habit. It had served her. Everything was in order. The primary registration office opened at 8. She was through the door at 8 past, before the second clerk had finished removing his coat. The clerk at the primary desk was a young man named Ferris. She had researched the staff roster the previous afternoon, who had been in his position for 14 months and had no recorded connection to any of the Voss Network's subsidiary structures. He looked at the blackthorn seal on the documentation with the careful neutrality of someone who understood that certain names required a different quality of attention. "Duchess Blackthorn," he said. "I'd like to file for grant continuation," she said. "Western Provinces, parcels 11 through 19. The full documentation is here." He took the case. He opened it. He read with the methodical pace of someone doing his job correctly, and she stood on the other side of the desk and waited, and the office filled slowly around her with the ordinary traffic of a city's morning bureaucracy, clerks arriving and taking their positions, the smell of coal fires and old paper. It took 40 minutes. At the end of 40 minutes, Ferris stamped the documentation with the primary office seal, entered the filing in the registration ledger, and handed her the receipt. His expression throughout had been the expression of a man who was aware he was doing something that mattered, and was doing it correctly, and expected to be left alone to do so. "Filed," he said. "Effective today." "Thank you," she said. She was back in the carriage by 9. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the specific sensation of someone who has moved a piece on a board and understands that the move itself is not the game. The game is everything that happens next, and what happens next is now accelerating toward her at a speed she cannot fully calculate from her current position. The land grants were filed, legally established. It would take Voss's people time to build a challenge, and a challenge through official channels would be visible, documented, and subject to a standard of evidence that their informal network was not designed to meet. She had bought time. How much time was the question that accompanied her back north? She was 2 hours from the manor when the rider reached her. He came from the direction of the estate, a Blackthorn rider, not a stranger. and he pulled alongside the carriage with the controlled urgency of someone who had been told to find her quickly and not to alarm her while doing it. She had the window down before the carriage fully stopped. "Message from the Duke," he said. He handed her a folded note. She read it. "Come back quickly. Something has happened with Alderton." Mrs. Alderton was the housekeeper. She had been with the manor for 11 years. Vivian looked at the note for exactly 1 second, then looked at the writer. "How long ago did he send this?" "An hour, my lady." "Drive faster," she told her driver. The manor was wrong from half a mile out. She couldn't have named the specific quality of wrongness. Nothing visible had changed. The building stood as it always stood. The gates were as they always were. But something in the arrangement of the day felt off. The way a room feels off when something has been moved and you can't immediately identify what. 2 horses she didn't recognize were tied near the stable entrance. The front door was standing open in a way it was never standing open in this weather. She was through it before the carriage had fully stopped. Alistair was in the study. He was standing near the window, not looking out of it, just standing near it, which told her something about where he'd been putting himself while he waited for her. He turned when she came in, and his face had the particular quality of controlled anger that she had not seen on him before. Anger that had been running for some time and had been subjected to the discipline of a man who understood that uncontrolled anger was a liability. "Sit down," he said. "Tell me." "Sit down, Vivian." She sat. Not because she was shaken, she wasn't, not yet, but because the way he said it carried something that told her this required her full attention, and full attention was easier seated. He sat across from her. "At approximately 7 this morning," he said, "Mrs. Alderton admitted 2 men to the manor. She told the remaining staff they were from the estate solicitor's office, arriving to conduct a routine inventory review. They were in the East Wing records room for approximately 2 hours. Vivian was very still. "The Aldenmere documentation," she said. "Gone," he said. The word landed in the room with the specific weight of something irreversible. Gone. Not misfiled, not misplaced. Gone. Removed. Taken by 2 men admitted to the house by a woman who had been in it for 11 years and who had apparently, at some point in those 11 years, become something other than what she appeared to be. "Where is she now?" Vivian asked. "She left with them," he said. The stable hand saw the 3 of them go. He didn't think to question it. He paused. He had no reason to. "She's been here longer than he has." Vivian looked at her hands for a moment. They were steady. She noted the steadiness of them and understood it as the particular calm that arrives not from the absence of feeling, but from the arrival of something so clarifying that feeling becomes temporarily irrelevant. "What's in the documentation?" she asked. "Orders," he said. "Signed orders from the final stage of the Aldenmere campaign. A decision I made regarding the Eastern Column. The withdrawal timetable. 63 men." She waited. "They didn't make it out," he said. His voice was precisely level. "The timetable I approved was the one that served the campaign's strategic objective. It was not the one that gave the Eastern Column time to withdraw safely. I knew that when I signed it. The campaign's commanders knew it. The Emperor at the time knew it." He stopped. "What the documentation does not show is that context. What it shows is my signature on a decision that cost 63 lives." The fire moved in its grate. Outside, through the window, Alistair was no longer standing near. The north field was pale with frost under a sky that had been gray since morning and showed no intention of changing. "Voss has had this for how long?" she asked. "He's had access to it," Alistair said. "He's been holding it in a location I couldn't reach for 12 years. Alderton was the insurance mechanism. If he moved the documentation to his own holdings, it would appear on records that could be traced to him. This way," he stopped. "This way it appears to have been stolen from you," she said, "which means he can surface it wherever he chooses and claim he obtained it legitimately." "Yes." Vivian looked at him. There was something in his face that she had not seen there, underneath the controlled anger, underneath the precision of a man running calculations in real time, something older and less armored. The specific expression of someone who has spent 12 years managing a threat and has just discovered that the management itself was part of the trap. She thought about 11 years. about a woman making beds and managing household accounts and directing the kitchen and admitting two men through a door at 7 in the morning, and she thought about what it took to do that. Not the logistics, but the interior of it, the sustained commitment to a performance across 11 years, the way trust calculates itself in the gaps between suspicion and attention. Mrs. Alderton had been invisible in exactly the way all genuinely effective betrayal required its instruments to be invisible. Seen constantly, never examined. Even a man who spent 15 years performing his own mediocrity had not thought to examine the woman who made his house function. "He'll move within days," Vivian said. "He doesn't need to wait anymore. He has the grants filed, which he knows, and the documentation. He'll use one to set the terms and the other to enforce them." "Yes. Which means we need to change the board before he does," she said. "Vivian." He said her name the way he'd said it the night before, with that quality of weight, of attention that wasn't performance. "The grants won't matter if that documentation surfaces. The duchy, the recovery, everything we've built in 6 weeks, it becomes irrelevant the moment he puts those orders in front of the right people with the wrong framing." "I know." "The right people," he said, "currently include 3 members of the Imperial Council who have been looking for a reason to revisit the Aldenmere campaign for political purposes that have nothing to do with the actual events. If Voss reaches them first, then we reach them first," she said. He was quiet. "Alistair," she leaned forward. "Is there anyone on the Imperial Council who owes you something that isn't on Voss's ledger?" He thought about this for a moment, and she could see the architecture of it. The decades of relationships, the specific weight and history of each one, the calculation of which debts were old enough to be solid and which were recent enough to be contingent. "Hargrove," he said finally. "Not Lady Hargrove. Her husband, Lord Evander Hargrove. He was at Aldenmere. He was with the Northern Column." He paused. "He knows what the Eastern Column decision actually was. He was in the room when the Emperor approved it." "Can he be reached today?" "He's in the capital," Alistair said. "He's been attending the Jubilee preparation sessions. He'll be at the formal dinner tonight." The Imperial Founders' Jubilee. 3 days away. The single gathering of the year at which the Empire's full spectrum of power, military, financial, political, was present in one location, operating under the social protocols of celebration, which meant that the usual barriers between factions were lowered and the usual forms of communication between people who were not supposed to be communicating were temporarily available. She had understood this was coming. She had not understood until this moment how central it was about to become. "We need to be at that dinner," she said. "We were not invited," Alistair said. "We need to get invited," she said. "Today." He looked at her with the expression that she had started to read as his version of recognition, the specific look of a man encountering something he hadn't expected and finding it, without apparent resentment, more capable than his prior assessment. "Lady Hargrove," he said. "She said I chose well," Vivian said. "Let's find out what that's worth." The letter to Lady Hargrove was written and dispatched within the hour. It was written by Vivian in a register she had been developing for situations that required the appearance of absolute composure in the face of urgency. Formal enough to be taken seriously, specific enough to convey that she understood exactly what she was asking for and why. She did not explain the Aldenmere documentation. She did not need to. What she wrote was, "The Jubilee dinner, 2 seats, tonight if possible. The Duke and I have information relevant to discussions that will otherwise proceed in our absence." The response came back in 3 hours. 7 o'clock. Dress accordingly. They arrived at the Imperial Jubilee dinner in the carriage that bore the Blackthorn crest, and Vivian wore the only gown she had brought from the capital that was appropriate for an imperial event. Deep blue, formal, the kind of thing that communicated position without effort. Alistair wore his decorations for the first time since she had known him, and she understood, looking at him, that what had appeared from the outside to be an aging man with faded significance was something she had been reading through the same lens everyone else used, the lens of surface, and the decorations on his chest were not the decorations of a man who had been important. They were the decorations of a man who remained so. Lord Evander Hargrove found them before dinner was served. He was a large man, 70s, with the particular bearing of someone who had done something actual in his life, and carried it in his body rather than his title. He crossed the room toward them with the directness of a man who had decided something before he arrived. "Blackthorn," he said. "Evander," Alistair said. Hargrove looked at Vivian. "Duchess." Then, without preamble, lowering his voice to the specific register of a private conversation conducted in a public room. "Voss approached 2 council members this afternoon. I don't know what he said. I know what they looked like afterward." Vivian's chest tightened once, then steadied. "He has the Aldenmere orders," Alistair said. Hargrove was quiet for a moment. His face went through something that was not surprise. He was too old and too experienced for surprise of this kind. But something heavy, the expression of a man receiving confirmation of something he had hoped would not arrive. "How long has he had access?" Hargrove asked. 11 years, Alistair said. "The housekeeper," Vivian said. Hargrove looked at her. "You know about Alderton?" "I know she left with 2 men this morning," Vivian said. "I know she had 11 years to become invisible. I know Voss has been patient in ways that most people aren't patient." She held his gaze. "What I need to know is whether you can speak to what the Eastern Column decision actually was. Its context. What the Emperor sanctioned." Hargrove looked at her for a long time. She did not look away. She had been looked at tonight by people trying to assess her, assigning categories, running the familiar calculation of how seriously to take a woman who had appeared in their world 6 weeks ago via a wedding night scandal. And she had returned each look with the same even steadiness, the look of someone who has no energy to perform accessibility and no fear of the alternative. "The Emperor's sanction is documented," Hargrove said finally, "separately, in the Imperial War Archive. It was filed under a security classification that Voss doesn't have clearance to access." "Does he know it exists?" Vivian asked. "He knows something exists," Hargrove said. "He's been trying to reach it for 8 years. He hasn't managed it." "Then the documentation he has is incomplete," she said. "Incomplete but damaging," Hargrove said. "Without context, those orders read as—" "I know what they read as," she said. "What I'm asking is whether the context can be surfaced before he moves the incomplete version." Hargrove looked at Alistair. Something passed between them. The kind of exchange that happens between men who have known each other across a span of history that predates the current problem. A look that carried weight she could not fully read. "There's a process," Hargrove said carefully. "A formal request to the Imperial War Archive can be lodged by a sitting council member. The documents would be reviewed by the full council in closed session before any public disclosure." "How long does that process take?" she asked. "Normally, weeks," he said. "With the Jubilee and the full council present—" He paused. "If the request were lodged tomorrow morning, the closed session could be called before the public events begin." "Then lodge it," she said. The silence that followed was the silence of a man recognizing that he was being asked to do something significant, rapidly, at the request of a woman he had met approximately 12 minutes ago. "Duchess Blackthorn," he said. "Lord Hargrove," she said. "I've been managing my relationship with the Voss network for 6 years," he said. "If I move against him directly, the protections I've maintained are already gone," she said. "The moment he surfaced that documentation to the council members this afternoon, the board changed for everyone at this table, including you." She didn't say it harshly. She said it the way she said everything that mattered, directly, without ornament, with the specific calm of someone who has moved past the point where softening truth serves anyone's interest. "He's not managing you anymore. He's spending you." Hargrove looked at her. He looked at Alistair. Alistair said nothing. He was watching her with the focused stillness that she had learned in 6 weeks was his form of full attention, the absence of everything extraneous, leaving only the quality of a man who is completely present for whatever is happening. "All right," Hargrove said. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "Tomorrow morning," he said. She nodded. She picked up her wine glass. She took one deliberate sip and set it down, because the conversation was concluded and the evening still had several hours left in it, and she needed to know who else in this room had been visited by Voss's people this afternoon. It was past midnight when they returned to the carriage. She had identified two of the council members Voss had approached. Not difficult. Once she knew what behavioral shift to look for in a room full of people performing their usual social competence. She had spoken to both of them. She had not told them anything. She had listened, which was always the more productive activity, and she had confirmed that what Voss had shown them was the orders alone, stripped of any context, framed as evidence of a decision made for personal, rather than strategic reasons. She sat in the carriage and felt the exhaustion of the day settling into her body. Not the destructive exhaustion of failure, but the earned weight of someone who had moved through an extraordinary number of consequential situations in approximately 16 hours and was still intact. "Hargrove will file," Alistair said. "Yes," she said. "If the closed session happens before Voss moves publicly, we have a chance to control the framing." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "You handled him well," he said. "Hargrove." "He handled himself well," she said. "He made the right decision. I just made the timeline clear." "You made it impossible to make the wrong decision," he said. "That's not the same thing." She looked at him in the carriage's dim interior. Outside, the Capitol slid past them in the winter dark, gaslight and stone, and the particular silence of a city that was asleep but not quiet. She was about to respond when the carriage stopped. Not a gradual stop, a sudden one. The horses pulling up short with the specific resistance of animals that have encountered something in the road. She heard the driver call out, and then another voice, and then the door of the carriage opened from the outside, and a man she didn't know looked in at them with a face that was not hostile, but was not polite either. "Message for the Duke," he said. He handed an envelope through the door. He did not wait for a response. Alistair opened it. She watched his face. His face did not move, which told her more than any expression would have. He passed it to her. It was a single line. No signature, no seal. "Hargrove won't make it to morning. Find another way, or lose everything." The carriage was still stopped in the dark street, the horses standing, the driver waiting for a direction that neither of them had yet given. Vivian held the note. She thought about the dinner, about Hargrove's face when he said all right, about the two council members she had watched recalibrate their positions across a room over the course of 3 hours, the visible mechanics of allegiance in motion. She thought about Mrs. Alderton making beds for 11 years, and the black carriage at the end of a drive, and 63 men and a signature on an order that looked one way without the document that explained it, and another way entirely with it, and she thought about the specific architecture of what Harlan Voss had built, the patience of it, the depth of it, the way it reached into rooms she had not known to look at until the doors were already closing. She thought about the Jubilee. Tomorrow, the full gathering of the Empire's power, every general, every lord, every significant financial structure in the same building at the same time, operating under the lowered barriers of celebration. And Alistair beside her, still silent, watching her the way he always watched her when something was being decided, with complete attention and complete patience, as though the outcome was not yet written, and he understood that. There was a version of tonight where she handed the note back and said she didn't know what to do next. She did not live in that version. "Drive," she told the driver. "Where to, my lady?" She looked at Alistair. "The Jubilee begins at noon tomorrow," she said. "We need to be there before it does. And you need to tell me everything, Shasin, not the version you've been managing. Everything." The pause that followed was the pause of a man reaching a decision that could not be unmade. "Everything," he said. And in the way he said it, the weight of that single word, the specific quality of a man letting go of something he had been carrying alone for 15 years, she understood that whatever came next was going to be different from anything either of them had planned. The carriage moved, the city slid past in the dark. Tomorrow, the Empire would be watching. He told her everything between midnight and dawn. The carriage rolled north through the frozen capital streets and then onto the open road, and Alistair Blackthorne sat across from her in the narrow, dark, and dismantled 15 years of carefully constructed silence with the same precision he had brought to everything else, methodically, without self-pity, in the specific register of a man who has decided that the cost of continued concealment has finally exceeded the cost of the truth. Aldenmere was not what the official record described. The official record described a successful border campaign, tactically complex, ultimately decisive, conducted under the command of General Alistair Blackthorne with acceptable losses, and a resolution that had held for 2 decades. The official record was accurate in its outcomes and almost entirely silent on its methods. What the official record did not describe was the secondary operation, the one that had run alongside the military campaign, financed in part by Harlan Voss and 3 other capital interests who had understood early that the border territories, once pacified, would become the most productive agricultural land in the empire's western reach. The financing was not illegal, Alistair said. His voice in the dark carriage was the voice of someone delivering a deposition, exact, stripped of defense or plea, aimed only at accuracy. Private capital participation in imperial campaigns had been standard practice for 60 years. What made Aldenmere different was the arrangement that accompanied it. The arrangement, she said. The post-campaign land grants, he said. Specific parcels, pre-identified, designated for private acquisition at below-market rates in exchange for the financing. The Emperor approved it. I approved it. He paused. The Eastern Column decision was made in that context. The timetable I signed was the timetable that protected the Western approach, the approach that led to the parcels the investors had pre-identified. The Eastern Column's withdrawal timetable was compressed to hold that approach. She looked at him. She had known it was something like this. She had understood since the night of the note, since the name Harlan Voss first appeared on a page at 1 a.m, that whatever was buried in those documents was not a simple military decision made under pressure. It was something with money at its root, which was almost always the case with the things that lasted long enough to become leverage. 63 men, she said. 63 men, he said. Their names are in the imperial military record. I know all of them. The road moved under the carriage. The dark outside was complete. No moon, cloud solid from horizon to horizon, the only light the weak glow of the carriage lamp that moved with them and illuminated nothing beyond the immediate interior. Voss participated in the arrangement, she said, which means the documentation implicates him as well. Which is why he can't surface it through official channels, Alistair said. He can leak it. He can place it selectively in front of people who will use it against me without examining too carefully where it came from, but he cannot bring it formally before the council without exposing himself. And Hargrove? Hargrove was not part of the financial arrangement, Alistair said. He was present when the Emperor approved the Eastern Column timetable. His testimony establishes imperial sanction. That's why he matters, and why Voss sent the note. She thought about the note, about the specific phrasing of it. Hargrove won't make it to morning. She had been turning that phrase over since the carriage door closed, running it against the various things it could mean. It could mean threat. It could mean that Voss intended to act against Hargrove directly. It could also mean something more measured, a warning designed to paralyze, to make her and Alistair spend the hours between midnight and the Jubilee calculating whether Hargrove was safe when they should have been calculating something else entirely. He wants us reactive, she said. Alistair looked at her. The note isn't an announcement, she said. If he'd actually moved against Hargrove, he wouldn't warn us. He'd let us arrive at the Jubilee tomorrow and find out when it was too late to use Hargrove's testimony. The warning is the move. He wants us to spend tonight trying to protect Hargrove instead of finding another approach. Alistair was quiet for a long moment. You might be right, he said. I'm right, she said, which means Hargrove is probably fine, and we need to stop thinking about Hargrove and start thinking about what we do if he isn't. The Imperial War Archive, he said, the Emperor's sanction document. If we can access it directly. Through what authority? She said. We're not council members. We can't lodge the request ourselves. No, he said, but there are people at the Jubilee who can. Who? She said. He looked at her, and in the dim interior of the carriage, with the road moving under them and dawn still hours away, she watched something shift in his face. The last panel of the wall he had been maintaining for 15 years coming down, not dramatically, but with the particular quiet of something that has been under pressure for a long time and has finally run out of resistance. There are 4 generals at the Jubilee who served under me at Aldenmere, he said, not in the financial arrangement, and they, in the field. Men who know what the campaign actually was, what the decisions actually cost, and what would have happened to the Western territories without the financing that made the campaign possible. He paused. I have not spoken to any of them in 12 years. I severed the connections deliberately, to protect them from what I was carrying. She understood what he was telling her. He was telling her that he had spent 12 years alone with this because he believed that was the cost of protecting the people he had fought with. He was telling her that the isolation she had perceived in him, the deliberate diminishment, the performance of irrelevance, the manor in the north running at a fictional loss, was not only a financial strategy, it was a quarantine. He had made himself small so that the thing he was carrying could not spread. She sat with this for a moment. She thought about what it took to do that, to carry something for 12 years without putting it down, without asking anyone else to help hold it, to turn down the normal human requirements of connection and continuity because connection meant exposure, and exposure meant damage to people who deserve better than that. She thought about the corridor at Rowan House, the man who had found her standing at a window and offered her something real in an evening made of performance, and she understood now with a fullness she hadn't had access to before what it had cost him to do even that, to reach toward another person after 12 years of deliberate isolation. She did not say any of this. Some things were not improved by being said aloud. Write down their names, she said. He looked at her. The 4 generals, she said. Write down their names, their positions, and everything you know about where they'll be tomorrow at the Jubilee. And then sleep. You need to sleep. We have 4 hours before we reach the manor, and we leave again at 9, and I need you functional. Something moved through his face. Not the recognition she had learned to read, something different from that, something she didn't have a word for yet, that she cataloged and set aside for a time when the immediate situation wasn't demanding everything she had. You don't sleep, he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation. Not tonight, she said. He wrote the names. He slept eventually with his head against the carriage wall and his face in profile against the dark window, and she sat across from him with 4 names on a sheet of paper and the accumulated weight of everything she now knew and spent the remaining hours building the approach she would need for tomorrow. By the time they reached the manor, she had it. They left again at 9. The manor staff watched them go with the particular expression of people who understood that something significant was happening and had been given no information about it, which was the right policy, but generated a specific kind of worried silence in a household. She had spoken briefly to the senior footman before leaving, calm, clear, no detail beyond what was necessary. The estate continues normally. Nothing is disrupted. She meant it. Whatever happened at the Jubilee, the land grants were filed, the tenants were working, the recovery was in motion. She had built something in 6 weeks that did not depend entirely on her being present to continue. That mattered. The Jubilee grounds were the Empire's oldest ceremonial site, a complex of buildings that had been expanded and modified across 2 centuries until they represented a kind of architectural argument about power, each generation's additions competing with the last in scale and formality. Banners in imperial colors ran the length of the entrance avenue. Carriages were arriving in a continuous stream by 10 in the morning, each one carrying a different configuration of the Empire's authority: military, political, financial, noble, all of it converging on the same building for the same stated purpose of celebrating an unbroken imperial lineage, and for the real purpose, which was the annual renegotiation of every alliance, debt, and arrangement that governed how the Empire actually functioned. She had been to the Jubilee twice before, both times as a guest of the Ashcroft family, positioned in the moderate social tier, present but not consequential, one of the hundreds of minor and mid-level noble families who attended because attendance was expected and whose presence served primarily to fill out the room. She was not arriving in that capacity today. The Blackthorn carriage bore a crest that she had seen people respond to all morning with a specific quality of attention. The attention given to things that were familiar but had not been seen recently enough to be current. People knew the name. They had simply, over 12 years, filed it in the past tense. The crest moving through the Jubilee gates this morning had the quality of something they'd believed was finished returning without announcement. She felt Alistair beside her register this without expression. They separated inside. Not by plan, exactly, by necessity. The 4 generals he had named were in different locations within the complex, and reaching all of them before the formal proceedings began required two people moving efficiently through a large space, each one knowing what to say and how to say it. She had spent the carriage ride briefing Alistair on her approach in the same register he used with her: direct, specific, without excess. "Don't ask them for anything," she had said. "Tell them what's at stake and let them make the decision. They're men who have made decisions under pressure. Managed pressure produces resentment. Real information produces action." He had looked at her. "You've done this before." "My father's business negotiations," she said. "Different scale. Same architecture." General Aldrich Vane was the first name on her list. She found him near the Eastern Gallery, speaking with two men she didn't know, and she waited with the patience of someone who understood that interrupting a conversation was a social cost, and timing the approach was not a luxury but a requirement. When the two men moved away, she crossed to him. He was 60, broad, with the kind of face that had been weathered into something that looked like severity, but might have been, under different circumstances, something more accommodating. He looked at her with the immediate recognition that her name and title produced: the recalibration, the assessment. "Duchess Blackthorne," he said. "General Vane," she said. "I need 4 minutes of your time." He gave her the 4 minutes. She used 3 of them. She laid out the Aldenmere documentation, Voss's move, Hargrove's position, and the War Archive request in the specific sequence that made the architecture of the problem comprehensible to a military mind: situation, threat, required action, timeline. She did not editorialize. She did not ask him how he felt about it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You're asking me to publicly associate myself with a 12-year-old campaign decision," he said. "I'm telling you that the decision is going to be publicly surfaced regardless," she said, "and that the difference between it being surfaced with context and without context is whether you act in the next 2 hours." He looked at her for a long moment. "Blackthorne sent you," he said. "Blackthorne told me your name," she said. "I sent myself." Something shifted in his face. Not warmth. These were not warm circumstances, but a form of respect that functioned, in the current moment, as its effective substitute. "The War Archive request," he said. "Who lodges it?" "You do," she said, "with 3 co-signatories from the Council. I have 2 confirmed. I need the request to carry military standing." "And the 4th general?" he said. "My husband is handling the other 3, she said. He looked at her. He looked across the room in the direction where, presumably, Alistair was. Then he looked back at her. "Give me an hour," he said. She nodded and moved. The next 2 hours were the most controlled performance of her life. She moved through the Jubilee complex with the specific efficiency of someone who has a map in their head and a timeline that cannot slip, stopping for the conversations that mattered and moving through the ones that didn't with a speed that was not rude because she had learned how to exit a conversation without leaving damage. She identified the 2 council members whose support she needed and reached both of them. The first was straightforward, a man who had been watching the Voss network with concern for years and required only the confirmation that a formal mechanism existed for addressing it. The second was harder, a woman who understood the political cost of associating herself with Aldenmere and needed more than information. She needed to understand what the alternative looked like. "If the documentation surfaces informally," Vivian told her, "it will be used to discredit the Aldenmere campaign's outcomes, which means the border territories come back into political play, which means the land grants that have been operating under imperial protection for 20 years are suddenly contestable." The council member's expression changed. "There are 12 noble families," Vivian said, "currently holding land under those grants. I can give you the names in 60 seconds if you need them." "No," the council member said. "I know the names." "Then you know what's at stake," Vivian said. The woman looked at her for a moment, a look that had nothing to do with social assessment and everything to do with the specific calculation of someone encountering another person who has done the work. "I'll sign the request," she said. At noon, with the formal Jubilee proceedings 30 minutes from beginning, Vivian found Alistair near the main hall entrance. He had reached 2 of the 3 generals. The third had declined, not hostile, simply unwilling to move without more time than the situation allowed. "We have Vane," she said, "and the 2 council members." The War Archive request can be lodged with what we have, he said. It needs to be lodged now, she said, before the formal proceedings. Once Voss is in that room with the full assembly present, he has options he doesn't have right now. I know, he said. They moved toward the administrative wing together, and she was aware, acutely, in the specific way you become aware of your own body under pressure, of the quality of moving with him, the way they had calibrated to each other's pace without discussion, the absence of the management she'd been subject to in every partnership she'd been part of before this one. They were not performing unity, they were simply operating, side by side, with the economy of people who had been under pressure together long enough to trust each other's judgment without requiring it to be explained. The War Archive request was lodged at 12:47. The formal proceedings began at 1. Harlan Voss arrived at 1:15. She saw him enter the main hall with the peripheral attention she'd been maintaining on the room's entrance since they'd taken their positions. He was, as she remembered, pleasant, contained, carrying his authority without apparent effort, and he moved through the arriving crowd with the ease of a man who had spent decades in rooms like this and had never had reason to feel anything other than certain in them. He saw Alistair first. The recognition moved through his face with the speed of something he had prepared for. Not surprise, but the activation of a plan that had been waiting. He made a small movement, the gesture of a man signaling to someone across a room, and she tracked the signal to a younger man near the eastern gallery who received it and moved toward the corridor. Going to retrieve the documentation, she thought, or going to reach someone who had it. Voss crossed the floor toward them. Blackthorne, he said. His voice was pleasant, exact, carrying the courtesy of a man who intends to bury you and sees no reason to be impolite about it. I hadn't expected to see you here. Harlan, Alistair said. Voss's eyes moved to Vivian. Something moved through them, not dismissal, she was past the point where she warranted dismissal, but a reassessment, rapid and controlled, the look of someone encountering a variable they had not fully weighted. Duchess Blackthorne, he said. The Empire has been talking about very little else since your wedding. I imagine, she said. A remarkable night, he said. Remarkable several weeks, from what I understand. His gaze was pleasant and entirely without warmth. I hope the Duchy is treating you well. Extremely, she said. He looked at Alistair. The pleasantness in his face remained exactly as it was, unchanged, which was the specific quality of a man who had decided that the social surface was the most efficient weapon he had available. I wonder, he said, if we might find a few minutes this afternoon for a private conversation. There are some matters I'd like to discuss with you. Old accounts, as it were. Things that have been sitting unresolved for some time. Of course, Alistair said, though I suspect the afternoon may become complicated. Oh? Voss said. There's a War Archive request before the Council, Alistair said. Filed this morning. I understand it's scheduled for closed session review before the evening banquet. The pleasantness in Harlan Voss's face did not disappear, but something beneath it changed. The specific subsurface shift of a man whose calculation has just encountered a variable he did not include. I wasn't aware of any pending archive business, Voss said. These things move quickly, Vivian said, when the right people are motivated. Voss looked at her, and for the first time since she had been tracking his face across a room and across a table and in the specific geography of a conversation that had been building for 6 weeks, she saw something in it that was not pleasant and was not certain and was not the controlled exterior of a man who had never been required to account for himself. It was the look of a man who understood that the ground beneath him had changed while he was watching the wrong thing. He recovered it quickly. The pleasantness returned. But she had seen it, and he knew she had seen it, and the three of them stood in the main hall of the Imperial Jubilee, in the full presence of the Empire's assembled power, and held that knowledge between them in silence for exactly as long as it took all three of them to understand what had just happened. Excuse me, Voss said. He moved away toward the corridor where his associate had gone. She watched him go. He'll move fast, Alistair said quietly. Yes, she said. The closed session, if he reaches the 2 council members before it convenes, he'll try, she said. He won't reach both of them. The woman I spoke to this morning is not reachable by him on this. You're certain? She has 12 families on those land grants, Vivian said, including her own. Alistair looked at her. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the carriage, in the corridor, across the breakfast table at Blackthorn Manor, with the full quality of his attention, stripped of every layer except the one that was simply, exactly present. And she felt it, standing in the middle of the Empire's annual gathering, in the noise and press of 300 powerful people performing the rituals of an empire she had spent the last 6 weeks learning to navigate from its interior. She felt it the way you feel something you have been careful not to name, because naming it creates obligations you are not certain you can meet. "Vivian," he said. "Not now," she said. "No," he agreed. "Not now." The hall filled. The formal proceedings began with the traditional address from the Imperial Chancellor, a man named Greaves, whom she had been watching all morning with the specific attention she gave to figures whose position made them structurally important, and who had been moving through the room with a quality of careful neutrality that she had initially read as temperament and was beginning to read as something else entirely. She was watching Greaves cross the room toward the Chancellor's podium when Alistair's hand closed briefly on her arm. She looked at him. His face was completely controlled, but his eyes had found something across the room, something in the direction of the eastern gallery. And she followed his line of sight and saw, standing near the gallery entrance with the specific stillness of men who are waiting for a signal rather than participating in an event, 3 figures she did not recognize. Not Jubilee guests, not staff. Something in the way they occupied the space was wrong. Too still, too positioned, the specific quality of people who had come to a room with a purpose that had nothing to do with its official function. "Greaves," Alistair said quietly. She looked back at the Chancellor. Greaves had reached the podium. He was arranging his papers. He looked from here like a man about to deliver a formal address, but his eyes moved once, quickly, to the eastern gallery and then back to his papers. "He's Voss's," she said. The understanding arrived not in stages, but whole, the way the right answer to a problem arrives when you've been holding all the pieces long enough. "Greaves is Voss's. The formal proceedings, Alistair said, his voice dropping below everything, are the mechanism. Once Greaves opens the session, he has the authority to introduce emergency business before the closed session can be called. He can surface the documentation formally with imperial procedural cover before the archive request has been reviewed." She looked at the 3 still figures near the gallery. She looked at Greaves. She looked at the room. 300 people taking their seats, the full assembly of the Empire's authority. Everyone who mattered in the same space at the same moment, and the man about to address them holding a document she could not see that would undo everything she had built in 6 weeks, and everything Alistair had protected for 15 years before that. She had perhaps 90 seconds. The hall was settling into the anticipatory quiet of a large assembly coming to order, the specific silence of people who have stopped their own conversations and turned toward the front of the room. Alistair was already moving, not toward Greaves, toward the 3 figures near the gallery, moving with a speed and directness that was nothing like the careful, measured quality she associated with him. Moving like a man who had put down everything he'd been carrying for 15 years and found that without the weight he was capable of a velocity he had forgotten. She turned toward the council member she had spoken to that morning, the woman, second row, already seated, already watching the podium, and she covered the distance between them in a time that later she would not have been able to precisely account for. And she leaned down and said 3 words into the woman's ear. The council member stood up. Greaves had opened the ledger on the podium. The room was silent. The council member's voice cut through the silence with the particular authority of a woman who had spent 40 years learning how to use a room. "Point of order," she said. Every head in the assembly turned. Greaves looked up from his ledger, and in the eastern gallery, one of the 3 still figures had his hand inside his coat, and Alistair was 6 feet away and closing, and the whole enormous machinery of this moment, everything that had been building since the night at Rowan House, since a black carriage at the end of a drive, since a corridor and a note and 63 names in a military record, and 15 years of a man making himself small to protect something that had turned out to be larger than even he had understood, was converging on the next 30 seconds, in a way that left no room for anything except what happened next. Vivian straightened up from the council member's ear. She looked across the room at Alistair. He was looking back at her. And in the specific quality of that look, the fraction of a second between whatever came before and whatever came after, she understood that they had reached the exact point where everything either held or didn't, where the ground either proved solid or proved to have been built on the same fiction as everything else, and that what happened in this room in the next 30 seconds would be remembered or would be buried, and there was no version of either that she was afraid of. Her hands were steady. The council member's voice was still carrying. Greaves had not yet spoken. The three figures in the gallery had not yet moved. And Harlan Voss, somewhere behind her in the assembled hall, had just understood that the room he had walked into was not the room he had prepared for. And the sound of a man of his specific architecture encountering that realization was not a sound at all. It was a silence. The silence of 30 seconds that would settle everything. The 30 seconds lasted longer than 30 seconds. That was the thing about moments of genuine consequence. They expanded. The way serious injuries expanded in the first instant before the pain arrived, the body's specific mercy of slowing time at the precise point where time mattered most. Vivian stood in the main hall of the Imperial Jubilee with the council member's voice still carrying across the assembly and watched the room reorganize itself around the interruption with the particular violence of a large machine encountering an unexpected obstruction. Greaves had stopped. His hands were flat on the ledger. His face had the expression of a man running calculations faster than his composure could keep pace with, and the calculation he was running was the same one Voss had run 30 seconds earlier in a different part of the room. The calculation of a plan encountering a variable it had not waited, trying to find the path through and not finding it. The council member, her name was Lady Saren Aldwick, and Vivian would not forget it, had the floor. A war archive request was filed this morning, Aldwick said, addressing the assembly with the specific authority of a woman who had learned that authority was mostly a function of not asking permission to use it. Filed by 4 signatories, including 2 sitting council members and General Aldrich Vane. The request pertains to imperial documentation from the Aldenmere campaign and requires closed session review before any related business can be introduced to the open assembly. She looked at Greaves. I move that the formal proceedings be held pending that review. The silence that followed was the silence of 300 people simultaneously recalculating. Greaves looked at the ledger. He looked at the room. He was not, Vivian understood in this moment, a man who had ever expected to be visible. He had been most useful in the background, in the administrative machinery, in the specific invisibility of a chancellor who processed procedure without appearing to drive it. Visibility was not his medium, and the room was looking at him now with 300 pairs of eyes and the specific attention of an assembly that has just registered that something is happening that was not on the program. He closed the ledger. It was not a decision so much as the absence of an alternative. Without Voss's signal, without the documentation in hand, without the procedural cover of an uninterrupted opening address, there was no path through the next 60 seconds that didn't make his position worse. He closed the ledger and stepped back from the podium with the expression of a man who has just understood that the ground he was standing on had been built by someone else, for purposes that did not include him surviving when they stopped being useful. In the eastern gallery, Alistair had reached the 3 figures. She watched it from across the room. Not a confrontation in the physical sense, nothing so direct. He stood in front of the lead figure and said something she couldn't hear, and whatever he said it at a volume and with a quality that required the man to decide something quickly. The man decided. He stepped back. The other 2 followed. And Alistair stood in the gallery entrance with his decorations on his chest and his posture carrying the specific density she had first noticed in a corridor at Rowan House, and understood now as the residue of a man who had made decisions under conditions where the wrong decision had permanent consequences and had been doing it long enough that the capacity for it had become structural. He looked across the hall at her. She looked back at him. There was nothing to communicate that hadn't already been communicated. They had done what they came to do, and whether it held would be determined in the next hour in a closed session she was not permitted to attend. And the only thing left to do with this specific moment was to stand in it without performing anything. She stood in it. Lady Aldwick had called the procedural motion. A second council member confirmed it. Greaves, from his position behind the vacated podium, did not contest it. The formal proceedings were suspended. The closed session was called for 2 o'clock. Harlan Voss left the main hall at 1:43. She tracked his exit with the peripheral attention she had been maintaining on him since his arrival. The pleasant exterior still in place, the walk still carrying its habitual ease, the expression still occupying the social register of a man who has no reason to appear concerned. But the direction he was moving was away from the administrative wing, where the closed session would convene, and she understood that the direction itself was the decision. He was not going to contest the archive review. He was going to remove himself from the blast radius and wait to see what the session produced and adjust from there. It was, she acknowledged, a sensible strategy. It was also, she understood with a clarity that had nothing to do with satisfaction, the strategy of a man who had just discovered that he had spent 12 years holding leverage over someone who had spent the same 12 years building something the leverage could not reach. Alistair was beside her before she'd completed the thought. He said nothing immediately. They stood at the edge of the main hall as the assembly moved around them toward the various rooms and corridors of the Jubilee complex. The formal proceedings dissolved into the informal circulation that people defaulted to when the official program changed without warning. "The session," she said. "Hargrove is in it," he said. "He received word this morning. Not the kind we feared." Voss didn't move against him. He moved the documentation instead, tried to reach the council through Greaves. When that failed, he paused. "Hargrove is in the session. Vane is in the session. The archive materials are being retrieved now." She nodded. "It'll take 2 hours," he said. "Then we wait," she said. They found a room off the main corridor, a sitting room, unoccupied, the kind of ancillary space that large formal venues maintain for exactly the human requirement of having somewhere to go when the formal spaces become untenable. Someone had left a fire going. She sat near it. He sat across from her, and they were quiet in the specific way that people are quiet when there is nothing useful left to say, and saying something would only be performing the management of silence. She looked at the fire. She thought about the 63 men, about the names Alistair had said he knew, about the specific weight of carrying that across 15 years, not as guilt in the simple sense, she didn't think it was that, but as a debt that could not be discharged because the people owed it were no longer present to receive payment, which was its own particular architecture of damage. She thought about what a person becomes when they carry something like that without putting it down, how it shapes the spaces they allow themselves to occupy, how it explains a man who could spend 12 years making himself small, not because he lacked the capacity for more, but because he had decided, somewhere in the accounting of what he owed, that more was not something he was permitted. "The Eastern Column decision," she said. He looked at her. "You made it again in that gallery," she said. "Just now. You walked across the room and you stood in front of those men and you said something that made them step back. You didn't ask me first. You didn't calculate it. You just moved." "The situation required it," he said. "Yes," she said. "It did. And you were capable of it." She held his gaze. "You've been capable of it the entire time. You've just been telling yourself that capability was something you had to pay for before you were allowed to use it again." The fire moved in its grate. "Vivian," he said. "I'm not absolving you of anything," she said. "I don't have the standing for that, and it wouldn't mean what you needed it to mean, even if I did. 63 men are still 63 men, and that doesn't change." She paused. "What I'm telling you is that the way you've been punishing yourself for it has been as much about control as it has been about contrition. You made yourself the only person who knew the full weight of it because that meant you were the only person who could manage it. That's not penance. That's just a different form of command." The silence that followed this was the longest silence she had experienced with him, which meant something given how comfortable with silence he generally was. "You've been thinking about this for a while," he said. "Since the carriage," she said. "Last night, while you slept." He looked at her with the full quality of his attention. She had learned every register of it by now, the social surface, the professional assessment, the specific density of his focus when something was being decided. This was none of those. This was something underneath all of them, the look of a man who has spent so long managing what other people see that he has nearly forgotten there is something to be seen. "I don't know," he said carefully. how to stop carrying it. I know, she said, but I think you start by letting someone else know it exists, fully, not the strategic version. Not the version that protects me from the parts that are hardest to hear. She held his gaze. You've told me most of it. Tell me the rest. He told her the rest. It took 40 minutes, and the fire burned down by half while he spoke, and she listened the way she had always listened to the things that mattered, without interruption, without the management of her own response, without the social reflex of offering comfort before the person had finished requiring it. He told her about the Eastern Column, about the names, about the specific morning of the decision and what the air had smelled like, and how the signatures looked on the paper, and how he had folded that paper and handed it to a runner and turned back to the campaign map and continued working because the campaign required it. And he had been, at that point in his life, a man who believed that the capacity to continue working was the same thing as the capacity to manage consequence. When he finished, the room was quieter than it had been. She looked at him across the diminished fire. Thank you, she said. He looked at the fire. For what? For trusting me with it, she said. Not the strategic version. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, low and without any of the precision she associated with his constructed speech, I didn't expect you. I know, she said. When I saw you at Rowan House, he said, standing at that window, I recognized something. I didn't have a word for it at the time. What word do you have for it now? She asked. He looked at her. Someone who was doing the same thing I'd been doing, he said. For shorter, but with the same posture. Standing in a situation that was trying to define her and refusing to be defined by it. She was quiet. She thought about the window, the frozen kitchen garden below, the specific quality of standing inside a burning building and commenting on the architecture. She thought about how that postures, the spine straight, the face composed, the forward motion regardless of what was falling behind, had kept her functional through things that should have stopped her, and how it had also, when she examined it honestly, been its own form of the same thing she'd just named in him. Control as survival. The refusal to put anything down because putting things down felt like being overtaken by them. We're fairly well matched, she said. Something moved through his face, the outline of the thing she had catalogued on the night of the Jubilee dinner and set aside for later. It was clearer now. Yes, he said. We are. The door opened. It was General Vane. He looked at them both with the face of a man coming from a room where something consequential had been concluded, carrying it with him the way soldiers carry the aftermath of decisions. Not lightly, but without the performance of heaviness. The session is closed, he said. Vivian stood. The archive documentation establishes imperial sanction for the Eastern Column timetable, Vane said. Emperor's counter-signature dated 3 days before the campaign's final phase. The sanction document was filed under security classification at the time. Standard wartime protocol. He looked at Alistair. It's in the record now, open record. The council has reviewed it. Alistair stood slowly. Vane looked at him directly. The look between them was the look of men who had been in the same places at the same times and carried the same weight in different configurations and had not spoken in 12 years. It was the right call, Vane said. Given what we knew. Given what the campaign required. He paused. It was still 63 men. Yes, Alistair said. Both things are true, Vane said. That's the part that doesn't simplify. Alistair nodded once. Vane looked at Vivian. Chancellor Greaves has submitted his resignation. Effective immediately. Voss will face a formal inquiry. The financial documentation from Aldenmere has been included in the archive review. The council is convening tomorrow to determine next steps. He paused. The land grants stand. Western provinces, parcels 11 through 19, filed, confirmed, protected under imperial record. Thank you, General, Vivian said. He nodded and left them. The room was quiet again. Alistair was standing near the window, looking out at the Jubilee grounds, where the afternoon was moving toward its close, the banners in imperial colors catching the winter light. She watched his back. She watched the quality of his breathing. The specific adjustment of a man receiving news he has been bracing against for 15 years, and discovering that the thing you have been bracing against, when it finally arrives, is not the same shape as the thing you feared. He turned around. His face was not a man relieved. Relief implied the threat had simply passed, and 63 names didn't pass, and he was not the kind of man who would pretend they did. What his face held was something more specific than relief and more sustainable. The expression of someone who has been carrying a weight in isolation and has just understood for the first time that the isolation was self-imposed, and that putting the weight down did not mean abandoning it, only agreeing to carry it differently. She crossed the room. She stood in front of him, close, and she looked at his face with the same directness she brought to everything that mattered, and she said, "It doesn't go away." "No," he said, "but you don't have to be the only one who knows it's there anymore," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he lifted one hand and settled it against the side of her face. Not urgently, not dramatically, with the same economy he brought to everything. A gesture that was exact and deliberate, and asked nothing from her except to be received. She received it. Outside, the Jubilee continued its afternoon programming with the resilience of official events, which always continued regardless of what had happened in their margins. By the time they emerged from the sitting room, the assembly had reconvened in a modified format. Greaves's absence noted without public explanation, the formal address delivered by the council's senior member with the smooth institutional efficiency of a body that had been managing the gap between its public face and its internal reality for 2 centuries, and had developed considerable expertise in the transition. The evening banquet was quieter than the morning had been. Voss did not attend. Lady Aldwych found them near the end of the meal and sat across from them with the directness of a woman who had stopped performing social protocol sometime in her 50s and saw no reason to resume. "You move fast this morning," she said to Vivian. "The situation required it," Vivian said. Aldwych looked at her with the specific assessment of someone who has been watching people navigate power for 4 decades and is calibrating a new data point. "The Western provinces," she said. "You've been restructuring the Blackthorn estates." "Yes," Vivian said. "How much of the recovery is genuine versus the performance of recovery?" Aldwych asked. Vivian looked at her. "Come see the accounts," she said. "I'll show you." Aldwych held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. Once, the nod of someone making an appointment rather than performing courtesy. She left. Alistair leaned slightly toward her. "You just invited a council member to audit our estate accounts." "I invited a council member who has influence over the Western Province's land committee to see what we've built," she said. "There's a difference." "Is there anything," he said, with the specific quality of a man who had been asking himself this question since approximately the night they met, "that you don't convert into a structural advantage?" She looked at him. "Not yet," she said. "Ask me again in 20 years. Something happened in his face that she had not seen there before. Not the outline she had catalogued on the first night, not the recognition she had come to read as his form of approval, not the attention that had been the first thing she'd understood about him, and still the most consistent. Something past all of those. The expression of a man who has stopped managing the distance between himself and another person and discovered that the distance was the only thing he'd been managing for a very long time. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. She looked back at the room. The assembled machinery of the Empire's power, the generals and council members and lords and financial architects, all engaged in the ancient human project of performing stability over the top of instability, all of them carrying their own Aldenmere, their own version of the thing they hadn't put down yet. And she felt, in this moment, not triumph, not the clean narrative resolution of a woman who had been discarded at a wedding and risen to a duchess in the Empire's most celebrated household. What she felt was simpler than that, harder to name, and for that reason more durable. She had come into this marriage with nothing except her own capacity and the specific posture of someone who has refused to be defined by what was done to her. She was leaving this evening, this day, this 6 weeks, this series of decisions made in corridors and carriages and cold mornings at land registries, but with a duchy, a recovery, a partnership she had not planned for and had not known to want, and with the understanding, which was the most expensive thing she had ever purchased, that the people who hurt you most are not always your enemies. Sometimes they are only mirrors, showing you the version of yourself you would have become if you had stayed where you were. Cedric Rowan had not made her strong. She had always been strong. What he had done was make it impossible for her to pretend that staying small was the same as being safe. She owed him, in that sense, nothing, and she would spend nothing on him. The winter came fully into its own across the weeks that followed. At Blackthorn Manor, the North Field was frozen solid by the third week of the month, and the recovery work shifted to interior planning. The second phase of the estate restructuring, the correspondence with the Western tenants, the proposal she had been drafting for the Provincial Land Committee that would eventually carry Lady Aldwick's co-signature and become the framework for the duchy's formal designation as the Empire's Western Development Territory. She worked in the mornings. He worked in the adjacent room, because he had his own work, the military correspondence and historical documentation that had accumulated across 15 years of a man allowing himself to be underestimated, now being drawn carefully back into the light. They did not manage each other. They did not check in at intervals to confirm the other was still there. They simply occupied the same space with the same focused efficiency and met in the evenings with the accumulated material of separate days to examine together. It was, she found, the most functional arrangement she had ever inhabited. 3 weeks after the Jubilee, Cedric Rowan arrived at the manor. He came without announcement, or rather, with an announcement that arrived only an hour before he did, a letter she received and read and set down on her desk, with the specific stillness of someone receiving information they had been expecting for long enough that the actual arrival of it had a quality almost of confirmation rather than surprise. She told Alistair. "Do you want me there?" he asked. She thought about this honestly. "No," she said, "but I want you in the house." He nodded. No question, no qualification, simply the acknowledgement of a man who understood exactly what was being asked and found it reasonable. Cedric was shown into the front sitting room. He looked different from the last time she had seen him, which was from across a banquet hall, his back disappearing through a door, the broad shoulders of a man who had never in his life turned around to look at what he was leaving. He looked smaller. Not physically. He was the same man, same height, same build, but in the specific way that people look smaller when the social architecture that was magnifying them has been removed. He had lost something. She could see it in his posture and in his eyes and in the specific quality of his stillness, which was not the stillness of a man at ease, but the stillness of a man who has been moving very fast for a long time and has finally, through exhaustion or collision, come to a stop. "Vivian," he said. "Cedric," she said. She sat. She did not invite him to sit, and after a moment he sat anyway, on the edge of the chair across from her, with the posture of someone who does not feel entitled to the seat but has run out of other options. He looked at his hands for a moment. "I've been trying to figure out," he said, "what to say to you, since the Jubilee. Since before the Jubilee, honestly. Since—" He stopped. "Since the night you walked back into that room with him." "And?" she said. "And I keep coming back to the same thing," he said, "which is that I don't have the right to say any of it." She looked at him. She had thought, in the months since Rowan House, about what this conversation would feel like. She had imagined various versions of it, the version where she was cold, the version where she was cutting, the version where she was cold, the version where she was cutting, the version where she performed the indifference of someone who has fully moved past the injury. She had known, at some level, that none of those versions was quite right, because they were all still organized around him, around the management of her response to him, and what she had been learning in 6 weeks of building something real from the ground up was that the most honest response to a person who has done you damage is not indifference and is not anger, but is simply the truth, delivered without theater. "You didn't lose a marriage that night," she said. "You lost someone who would have built your future with you, if you'd given her the standing to do it. You had 2 years to understand what that was worth, and you spent them looking somewhere else." She looked at him directly. "That's not something I'm angry about anymore. It's just what happened." Cedric looked at her. His face had the expression of a man hearing something he has been saying to himself in his own head for months, confirmed from outside, which was always the hardest form of confirmation because it removed the last available argument that you were being too hard on yourself. "I know," he said. His voice was quiet. "I know." "Alara?" she said. "Gone," he said. She was... It wasn't what I thought it was. It was what I wanted it to be, which is a different thing. He paused. "I understand that now." "I'm sorry," she said. He looked at her. "You're sorry." "I'm sorry that you're learning it this way," she said. "That's a hard lesson to receive on those terms." She held his gaze. "I don't have anything else for you, Cedric. Not anger, not reconciliation, not the version of this where I tell you what you cost me in a way that gives you the opportunity to apologize for it. You didn't cost me anything I haven't recovered." She paused. "What you taught me, about what I was capable of when the scaffolding was removed, that turned out to be the most useful thing you ever gave me. I won't hold that against you." The silence that followed this was the silence of a man who has come a long distance expecting a particular kind of confrontation and found instead something he had no prepared response for. He stood, eventually. She stood. They looked at each other across the sitting room of Blackthorn Manor, across the distance of everything that had happened and everything that hadn't. And there was nothing in that look that required more time, more words, more management. "Take care of yourself," she said. He nodded. He left. She stood at the window and watched the carriage move down the drive, through the gates, out of sight. The north field was white and still beyond the boundary wall. The sky was the low gray of a winter afternoon that was not going to change. She heard Alistair's footsteps in the corridor. He appeared in the doorway. He looked at her face, reading it the way he read everything, with the focused attention of a man who trusted his own assessment more than he trusted reassurance. And whatever he read there settled him, because he didn't ask. He came and stood beside her at the window. They looked out at the white field together. "The drainage proposal for the north field," she said after a while. "I've been thinking about the third section. The gradient is wrong." "I know," he said. "I've been thinking about it too. We need to walk it in the spring," she said, "when the ground is soft enough to assess properly." "March," he said. "Early March, if the thaw comes on schedule." "I'll mark it," she said. They stood at the window. The winter held the land in its specific stillness, the kind of stillness that was not absence but dormancy. Everything below the surface still working, still building toward the conditions that would make April possible. She had been thinking about dormancy differently lately, about the things that looked finished and weren't, about the soil that received the harshest season and came out the other side, capable of producing something that bore no resemblance to the frozen ground that had preceded it. She looked at the field. She thought about what they had built in 6 weeks, and what they would build in the months that followed, and what the western provinces would look like in 5 years under the framework she and Aldwych were drafting, and what the Empire's historical record would eventually make of a marriage that had begun as the year's greatest scandal and had produced, quietly and without announcement, one of its most significant partnerships. She thought about the 63 names, and how they would always be there, and how carrying them differently was not the same as not carrying them, and how that distinction was something she and Alistair would return to across the years ahead without ever fully resolving it, because some things were not made to be resolved. They were made to be held with enough honesty that they couldn't calcify into something worse. She thought about a corridor, and a note, and a black carriage at the end of a drive. She thought about the white dahlias, standing in their towers in the candlelight of a night that had ended nothing and begun everything. Beside her, Alistair's hand found hers. No announcement, no ceremony. The simple economical gesture of a man who had spent 15 years deciding what he was permitted and had arrived, in this room, on this winter afternoon, at the understanding that permission was not the architecture he needed anymore. She held his hand. Outside, the field held its winter silence, patient and absolute, knowing something about April that February could not yet confirm. They stood in it together, and the house around them held them the way houses hold the things that matter, quietly, without comment, in the specific warmth of walls that have finally found the people they were built to keep.